chimed 3 times into the London fog, its bronze bells cutting through air thick enough to choke a horse. Most of the city slumbered, wrapped in wool blankets and ignorant bliss, but Thomas Whitmore was already pulling on his flour-dusted boots. At 28, he bore the weathered hands and permanent wheeze of a man twice his age, the calling cards of a Victorian. Baker. Thomas lived in a cramped tenement above Aldgate, sharing 2 rooms with his wife Mary and their 3 young children. The walls were thin enough that he could hear Mrs. Patterson next door coughing up what sounded suspiciously like pieces of her lungs. Consumption was common in their neighborhood, though nobody spoke its name aloud. Speaking it might make it real, and reality was already harsh enough. The morning ritual began the same way it had for 8 years. Thomas lit a single candle, its flame dancing in the drafty room, casting long shadows across peeling wallpaper. He dressed quietly, careful not to wake Mary, who worked 16-hour days in a textile mill and needed every moment of rest. His clothes were simple but practical: thick wool trousers, a cotton shirt that had once been white, and a leather apron already stained with the ghosts of 1,000 loaves outside. London's streets were a maze of cobblestones slick with morning dew and substances better left unidentified. Gas lamps flickered weakly through the fog, creating pools of sickly yellow light that barely penetrated the gloom. Thomas pulled his cap low and began the 20-minute walk to Hartwell's bakery, where he had worked since he was old enough to lift a flour sack without breaking his back. The streets told their own stories in the pre-dawn hours. He passed the night soil men finishing their rounds, hauling away the contents of London's cesspits in horse-drawn carts that reeked of human waste and lime. These men earned decent wages for their unsavory work, but Thomas often wondered if breathing bread, flour, and coal smoke was really any better than what they endured. A group of chimney sweeps shuffled past, their faces blackened beyond recognition, looking like moving shadows against the gaslight. Most were boys no older than 10, sent up narrow flues to scrape away soot and creosote. Thomas had heard the stories: boys getting stuck, suffocating in chimneys, their lungs destroyed by years of inhaling particles that turned their spit black. At least in the bakery, death came more slowly. The fog grew thicker as he approached the Thames, carrying with it the stench of the river. Londoners called it the Great Stink, a mixture of sewage, dead fish, industrial waste, and the lingering smell of the tanning yards along the riverbank. The government kept promising to clean it up, but promises didn't make the air any easier to breathe. Thomas pulled a handkerchief over his nose and mouth, a habit that would serve him well once he reached the bakery. Hartwell's bakery occupied the basement level of a narrow building on Pudding Lane, a location that seemed deliberately chosen to mock the Great Fire of London that had started on this very street 2 centuries earlier. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas, who spent his days dancing with flames hot enough to melt copper. He descended the stone steps, each one worn smooth by decades of baker's boots, and pushed open the heavy oak door. The familiar assault on his senses began immediately. Heat rolled out like a physical wall, carrying with it the smell of burning coal, yeast, and something else, something chemical and sharp that made his eyes water. The other bakers were already at work, their faces illuminated by the hellish glow of the ovens. "Morning, Tom," called out William Hartwell, the bakery's owner and a man whose family had been poisoning London's bread supply for 3 generations. Not intentionally, of course, but with a reckless abandon for ingredient quality that would have impressed a medieval alchemist. William was perpetually red-faced from the heat, his bald head gleaming with sweat even in winter. He wore the same flour-stained waistcoat every day, a garment so thoroughly saturated with grease and grime that it could probably stand up on its own, mourning. "Mr. Hartwell," Thomas replied, already feeling the familiar tightness in his chest as the warm air hit his lungs. The basement had no windows, no ventilation except for a single chimney that barely managed to draw away the smoke from 4 massive brick ovens. The air was thick enough to cut with a knife, a mixture of coal smoke, flour dust, and the breath of 6 men working in a space meant for 2. The ovens themselves were magnificent in their terrifying simplicity. Built from red brick and iron, they stood like ancient altars to some hungry god. Each one was large enough to hold dozens of loaves, heated by coal fires that had to be fed constantly throughout the day. The temperature inside reached levels that could bake a man's eyeballs if he got to. Close something Thomas had learned the hard way during his first week on the job. Getting the fires started was an art form that bordered on the occult. The coal had to be arranged just right, with kindling and paper positioned to catch the flame and spread it evenly. Too little fuel and the ovens wouldn't reach proper baking temperature. Too much and they risked an explosion that could level half the block. Thomas had seen it happen once, at Mitchell's Bakery, 3 streets over. The blast had killed 2 men instantly and left a third with burns so severe that he lived only another week, screaming in agony until the merciful end came. The coal itself was another source of concern. What they burned was the cheapest available, often mixed with slate, clay, and other impurities that produced toxic smoke. The government had passed laws about coal quality, but enforcement was spotty at best. Inspectors could be bribed, records could be falsified, and poor bakers like Thomas had no choice but to work with whatever fuel their employers provided. As the ovens heated, the real work began. Flour arrived in massive burlap sacks, each one weighing over 100 pounds. Thomas and his fellow bakers hauled these sacks down from street level, their backs straining under the weight. The flour wasn't the white, refined product that modern bakers take for granted. This was coarse, often gritty stuff that had been bulked up with cheaper ingredients to increase profits. Chalk was the most common additive, used to whiten flour that had a natural greyish tint. The practice was so widespread that most customers expected their bread to be unnaturally white. What they didn't know was that the chalk came from old plaster, ground up bones, and sometimes even cemetery headstones. Thomas had learned not to ask too many questions about ingredients. Ignorance might not be bliss, but it was certainly easier on the conscience. Alum was another favorite adulterant, a chemical compound that made bread appear fresher and whiter than it actually was. In small doses, alum might only cause stomach upset. In larger quantities, and quality control was haphazard at best, could lead to severe digestive problems, kidney damage, and worse. Thomas had seen customers return loaves that glowed faintly in candlelight, a sure sign that someone had gotten heavy-handed with the chemical whitening agents. The mixing process took place in enormous wooden troughs that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. Flour, water, yeast, salt, and whatever chemical enhancers were on hand got combined by hand, with bakers plunging their arms elbow-deep into the mixture. Personal hygiene was a luxury that few could afford. Most bakers worked shirtless due to the heat, their bare torsos soon coated with a mixture of sweat, flour, and coal dust that created a paste-like substance on their skin. Water for the bread came from the public pumps, and its quality was questionable at best. London's water supply was notoriously contaminated, with cholera outbreaks occurring regularly throughout the city. The Broad Street pump, just a few miles from the bakery, had killed over 600 people in a single outbreak just a few years earlier. But water was water, and bread needed to be made regardless of what microscopic horrors might be swimming in it. As Thomas kneaded the dough, his hands already aching from the repetitive motion, he thought about the customers who would soon be buying his bread. Working-class families who scraped together their pennies for a daily loaf, trusting that their local baker wouldn't poison them. Middle-class households whose servants would queue up before dawn for fresh rolls. Even some of the wealthy merchants and factory owners, though they could afford better, often bought from neighborhood bakeries out of habit or convenience. None of them knew about the chalk, the alum, the contaminated water, or the coal smoke that settled into every pore of every loaf. They saw white bread as a sign of quality, not understanding that the whiter the bread, the more likely it was to contain substances that had no business being anywhere near human food. The first batch of loaves went into the ovens at 5:30, just as the city began to stir. Thomas used a long wooden paddle to slide the shaped dough onto the oven floor, the heat singeing his forearms even through his shirt sleeves. The intense temperature was necessary to create the crust that customers expected, but it also meant that every day was a battle against burns, dehydration, and heat exhaustion. As the bread baked, filling the basement with the aroma that would soon draw customers from blocks away, Thomas allowed himself a moment to rest. His lungs felt heavy, as they always did by this time of morning, and his eyes were already watering from the smoke. By the end of the day, he would be coughing up black phlegm and struggling to catch his breath. But this was the life of a Victorian baker, and Thomas was one of the lucky ones. He had steady work, a roof over his family's head, and enough money to keep food on the table. The bread he made might slowly poison his customers, and the conditions he worked in might be killing him. But it was honest work in a city where honest work was hard to find. Outside, London was waking up, and soon the first customers would arrive, eager for their daily bread. They would smile and compliment the fresh aroma, hand over their coins, and trust that what they were buying was safe to eat. Thomas would smile back, take their money, and try not to think about what he knew. After all, everyone had to eat, and someone had to make the bread. The fact that it might kill them all in the process was just another cost of doing business in Victorian London. The chemistry of death by 7 o'clock. The morning rush was in full swing at Hartwell's bakery. Customers lined up outside the narrow storefront, their breath visible in the cold air as they waited for fresh bread. What they couldn't see was the chemical laboratory masquerading as a kitchen in the basement below, where Thomas Whitmore and his fellow bakers were engaged. In a daily dance with Death Dot, the ingredient suppliers had arrived before dawn, hauling sacks and barrels down the steep stone steps. These weren't the clean, regulated suppliers of modern times, but rather a collection of merchants, middlemen, and outright criminals who sold whatever they could pass off as food ingredients. Samuel Wickham, a rat-faced man with permanently stained fingers, was Hartwell's primary supplier of flour enhancers, a euphemistic term for the toxic cocktail of chemicals that transformed cheap, greyish flour into the white bread that customers demanded. Fresh shipment from the docks, Wickham announced, prying open a wooden crate with a crowbar. Inside were dozens of small cloth bags, each containing white powder that looked innocent enough. But Thomas had learned to recognize the different substances by smell and texture. The sharp, metallic scent meant alum. The chalky, Dusty feel indicated ground plaster of Paris. The faintly sweet smell that made his nose burn was arsenic trioxide, though Wickham always claimed it was premium whitening agent. Alum was the most widely used adulterant in Victorian bread, and for good reason. It worked almost like magic. A few spoonfuls mixed into a batch of dough would transform brown, coarse flour into something that baked into brilliantly white loaves with a fine, even crumb. Customers associated white bread with quality and purity, never suspecting that the whiter the bread, the more likely it was to contain substances that had no business being consumed by human beings. The alum that found its way into London's bread supply came from a variety of sources, most of them questionable. Some was legitimate potash alum, mined from natural deposits and used in textile dyeing, but much of what ended up in bread was industrial waste, scraped from the bottoms of dye vats or recovered from tanning operations. This industrial alum contained not just aluminum sulfate, but traces of lead, mercury, and other heavy metals that accumulated in the body over time. Thomas watched as a young apprentice. Peter Milhouse measured out the day's allotment of a lem, his hands already showing the telltale signs of chemical exposure. Peter's fingernails had developed white spots, and his gums were beginning to recede, early symptoms of aluminum poisoning that would only worsen with continued exposure. At 19, Peter looked older than Thomas, his face prematurely lined and his hair already thinning from the constant inhalation of toxic dust. "Careful with that, lad," Thomas warned, though he knew the warning was largely pointless. Everyone who worked in the bakery would eventually show signs of poisoning. It was simply a matter of how long they could continue working before their bodies gave out entirely. Some men lasted decades, becoming walking advertisements for the slow, insidious effects of chronic chemical exposure. Others, particularly the younger apprentices who worked closest to the mixing process, developed severe symptoms within a few years. The mixing process itself was a careful balance of chemistry and guesswork. Too little alum and the bread wouldn't achieve the desired whiteness. Too much, and it would have a distinctly bitter, metallic taste that even the most desperate customers would find unpalatable. The goal was to find the sweet spot where maximum whitening was achieved with minimal flavor impact, regardless of the long-term health consequences for consumers. But alum was just one component of the toxic mixture that went into Victorian bread. Chalk was another common additive, used both to bulk up the flour and to enhance its whiteness. The chalk used in bakeries didn't come from clean, natural deposits. Instead, it was often recycled material, ground-up plaster from demolished buildings, pulverized mortar from construction sites, and even crushed limestone from cemetery monuments. Thomas had once watched in horror as Wickham's men unloaded a cart full of what appeared to be broken headstones from St. Bartholomew Cemetery. When he questioned Wickham about it, the supplier had laughed and explained that old marble made excellent chalk for bread production. "The dead don't need their monuments," he had said with a grin that revealed his own yellow, rotting teeth. "But the living need their daily bread, eh?" The process of preparing these additives took place in a corner of the basement that Thomas had come to think of as the poison laboratory. Here, apprentices ground and sifted the various substances, creating clouds of toxic dust that filled the air and settled into their lungs. The grinding stones, originally designed for processing grain, were now permanently stained with residues of heavy metals and industrial chemicals. Bone ash was another common ingredient, providing both whiteness and bulk to the flour, but the bones used weren't always from animals intended for food production. Street dogs, dead horses, and even human remains from overcrowded cemeteries sometimes found their way into the boneyards where this ash was produced. The burning process was supposed to sterilize the material, but diseases like anthrax and tuberculosis could survive even high temperatures, especially when the burning was incomplete or poorly controlled. The water used in bread production presented its own set of challenges. London's water supply was notoriously contaminated, drawn from the Thames and distributed through a network of pipes that were often shared with sewage systems. The pumps that supplied water to the bakery were located just a few hundred yards from a tannery, where animal hides were processed using arsenic, mercury, and other toxic chemicals. The runoff from these operations inevitably made its way into the groundwater, creating a toxic soup that was then used to make the bread that fed much of London's population. Thomas had learned to recognize the signs of particularly bad water by its taste and smell. Some days, the water had a metallic tint that made his tongue tingle. Other days, it smelled faintly of sulfur or had a greenish tint that spoke of industrial contamination. But bread had to be made regardless of water quality, and customers seemed to accept that their daily loaves sometimes had an unusual flavor or texture. That yeast used in the bakery was another source of contamination. Fresh yeast was expensive and difficult to obtain, so bakers often relied on wild yeast cultures that were maintained in the bakery itself. These cultures lived in wooden vessels that were rarely cleaned, creating ideal breeding grounds for bacteria and mold. The resulting bread had a distinctive sour flavor that customers associated with traditional baking methods, never suspecting that they were consuming the byproducts of bacterial fermentation that included potentially harmful microorganisms. Salt, when it could be afforded, was often contaminated with sand, lead, and other impurities. Cheaper alternatives included saltpeter, potassium nitrate, and even small amounts of plaster of Paris. These substitutes provided the salty taste that customers expected, while adding their own toxic contributions to the final product. As Thomas worked with these ingredients day after day, he had begun to notice changes in his own body that went beyond the obvious effects of heat and physical labor. His teeth were becoming loose, a sign of lead poisoning from contaminated flour. His hands shook slightly when he wasn't actively working, and he had developed a persistent rash on his forearms that no amount of washing could eliminate. More troubling were the mental effects he had begun to notice. Some days, his thinking seemed sluggish, and he had difficulty remembering conversations or instructions. Other bakers had mentioned similar problems, but they attributed them to fatigue or the natural effects of aging. Thomas was beginning to suspect that the chemicals they worked with daily were affecting their brains as well as their bodies. The customers who bought their bread showed similar symptoms, though they rarely connected their health problems to their daily consumption of contaminated food. Stomach ailments were common throughout London, as were neurological problems that were attributed to everything from bad humors to moral failings. Children who ate large amounts of white bread often developed learning difficulties and behavioral problems that their parents blamed on laziness or moral weakness. Dr. Arthur Hayes, a physician and chemist who had begun studying food adulteration, had published reports documenting the widespread contamination of London's food supply. His microscopic examinations of bread samples revealed not just alum and chalk, but also sand, sawdust, bean flour, and in some cases, actual poisons like arsenic and lead. But his warnings fell largely on deaf ears, dismissed by industry representatives and government officials who saw food regulation as an unnecessary interference with free trade. The bakery owners themselves were often unaware of the full extent of the contamination in their products. They bought ingredients from suppliers who made vague claims about quality and purity, but rarely asked detailed questions about sourcing or processing methods. William Hartwell genuinely believed that he was providing a valuable service to his community, feeding working families with affordable bread that met their expectations for appearance and taste. As the morning wore on and the first batches of bread emerged from the ovens, Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the craftsmanship, even as he was haunted by knowledge of what went into the product. The loaves were perfectly golden brown, with crisp crusts and fine white interiors that would satisfy even the most demanding customers. They smelled wonderful, filling the basement with an aroma that made his mouth water despite everything he knew about their contents. The tragic irony was that the skills required to produce this poisonous bread were considerable. It took years of experience to know exactly how much alum to add for optimal whiteness without overwhelming bitterness. The timing of the baking process had to be perfect to achieve the desired crust while ensuring that the interior was fully cooked. The temperature control required constant attention and adjustment, as the coal-fired ovens were notoriously difficult to regulate. Thomas was a master craftsman, capable of producing hundreds of loaves of consistent quality under difficult conditions. But his mastery was in the service of a system that was slowly killing both the producers and consumers of its products. Every day, he used his considerable skills to create food that would contribute to the chronic illness and premature death of his customers, while simultaneously exposing himself to the same toxic substances that he mixed into their daily bread. The morning rush continued, with customers lining up to buy the fruits of this toxic labor, trusting that their neighborhood baker would provide them with safe, wholesome food. They had no way of knowing that their daily bread was laced with industrial chemicals, contaminated with waste products, and produced under conditions that would be considered criminal by later standards. As Thomas prepared the next batch of dough, measuring out flour, water, alum, and chalk with practiced precision, he tried not to think about the cumulative effect of all these small doses of poison. But the evidence was all around Jimin, the premature aging of his fellow workers, in the persistent health problems of his regular customers, and in his own declining health. The chemistry of death was being practiced daily in bakeries throughout London, disguised as the ancient and honorable craft of bread making. Rats, fire, and daily terror. The first sign of trouble that morning was the smell knot, the usual cocktail of coal smoke and chemical additives, but something else entirely. Thomas Whitmore paused in his kneading, his flour-dusted hands still deep in the dough, and sniffed the air. There it was again, the unmistakable stench of something rotting, something that had been dead for quite some time. "Peter," he called to the youngest apprentice, who was hauling a fresh sack of flour from the storage area. "Check that last delivery from Wickham. Something's gone off." Peter Milhouse, his 19-year-old face already bearing the premature lines of a man twice his age, dropped the flour sack and began examining the morning's shipment. It didn't take long to find the source of the smell. One of the burlap sacks, supposedly containing premium wheat flour, had a dark stain spreading from its bottom corner. When Peter lifted it, the smell intensified dramatically. "Jesus Christ," Peter muttered, then quickly crossed himself and glanced around to make sure William Hartwell hadn't heard the blasphemy. Religious cursing could cost an apprentice his position, and jobs were too scarce to risk over a moment's shock. Thomas wiped his hands on his apron and walked over to investigate. The stain was unmistakably organic, dark, viscous, and accompanied by that sweet, cloying smell that every Victorian knew but tried never to acknowledge. Death had a distinctive odor, whether it came from the overflowing cemeteries, the Thames at low tide, or apparently their flower supply. "Cut it open," Thomas instructed, handing Peter a sharp knife. "Carefully now. We need to know what we're dealing with." The blade sliced through the coarse burlap, revealing the flour inside. At first glance, it looked normal, enough the usual greyish-white powder that they transformed daily into London's bread supply. But as Peter spread the opening wider, they found the source of the contamination. Near the bottom of the sack, mixed in with the flour, were the partially decomposed remains of what appeared to be a large rat. This was not entirely uncommon. Grain storage warehouses throughout London were infested with rodents, and it was not unusual to find evidence of their presence in flour deliveries. But this rat had clearly been dead for some time before being ground up with the wheat. Its fur was gone, most of its flesh had liquefied, and what remained was a horrific mixture of bones, rotting tissue, and maggots that had somehow survived the milling process. "What do we do with it?" Peter asked, his face pale despite months of exposure to the bakery's various horrors. Thomas considered their options. The contaminated flour could be discarded, but that would mean a significant financial loss for Hartwell, and the bakery's profit margins were already razor-thin. They could try to remove the obvious contamination and use the rest of the flour, but there was no telling how far the decomposition had spread throughout the sack. Or they could follow the unofficial industry standard. Sift out the largest pieces and carry on as usual. "Get the fine sieve," Thomas said finally. "We'll strain out what we can and mix it with the other batches. The customers won't know the difference once it's baked." This pragmatic approach to food contamination was standard practice throughout Victorian London's baking industry. The economic pressures were simply too great to allow for the luxury of food safety. Bakers who discarded contaminated ingredients would quickly find themselves unable to compete with those who were willing to take shortcuts. The system rewarded those who could transform the most questionable ingredients into acceptable products while maintaining the lowest possible costs. As Peter began the process of sifting the contaminated flour, removing the largest pieces of organic matter while salvaging what he could of the rest, Thomas turned his attention to another pressing concern: the rats that were very much alive and currently making their presence known throughout the bakery. Hartwell's establishment was home to what could only be described as a thriving rodent ecosystem. Generations of rats had made their homes in the walls, under the floorboards, and even inside the brick ovens themselves. These were not the small, timid field mice that occasionally appeared in country bakeries. These were London rats, aggressive creatures that had grown fat on a diet of flour, yeast, and whatever else they could scavenge from the city's abundant refuse. The rats had learned the rhythms of the bakery as well as any human employee. They knew when fresh flour was delivered and would emerge from their hiding places to claim their share. They understood the baking schedule and would retreat to safety when the ovens were at their hottest, only to return when temperatures dropped to more comfortable levels. Some of the older rats had even learned to avoid the various traps and poisons that Hartwell periodically deployed, passing their survival knowledge on to their offspring. Thomas had developed a grudging respect for these creatures. They were, in many ways, his colleagues' fellow workers who helped themselves to the same toxic ingredients that he handled daily. The rats showed signs of the same health problems that plagued the human workers: patchy fur loss from chemical exposure, neurological problems that caused erratic behavior, and shortened lifespans that mirrored the early deaths common among bakers. But respect didn't mean tolerance. The rats were a constant source of contamination, leaving droppings throughout the work area, gnawing holes in flour sacks, and occasionally dying in inconvenient locations where their decomposing bodies would taint entire batches of ingredients. Just last week, Thomas had discovered a family of dead rats inside one of the mixing bowls, apparently poisoned by the alum residue that accumulated in the wooden vessel. The extermination efforts were largely futile. Poison that was strong enough to kill the rats was also dangerous to the human workers, and had to be used sparingly and carefully. Traps caught some of the younger, less experienced rodents, but the older rats had learned to avoid them. Cats were theoretically a solution, but most felines were reluctant to hunt in an environment saturated with toxic chemicals. The most disturbing aspect of the rat problem was how it normalized the presence of contamination in food production. Workers became so accustomed to finding rodent droppings in their ingredients that they developed efficient methods for removing the most obvious signs while accepting that some level of contamination was inevitable. Fresh rat droppings were picked out of flour before mixing. Older droppings, which had dried and partially crumbled, were often left in place on the assumption that the baking process would render them harmless. As Thomas worked through the morning's first batch of dough, he found himself automatically screening out foreign objects by touch. A hard lump might be a pebble, a piece of plaster, or a dried rodent dropping. Soft, squishy items could be anything from decomposing organic matter to lumps of coal dust that had been mixed with water. After 8 years in the bakery, his hands had developed an almost supernatural ability to identify and remove the most obvious contaminants while maintaining the speed necessary to meet production quotas. The fire hazard posed by the rats was another constant concern. The creatures had a habit of gnawing on anything they could reach, including the wooden handles of baking tools, the hemp ropes used to operate the oven dampers, and even the leather bellows that helped maintain proper air circulation. More than once, a piece of equipment had failed at a critical moment because rats had weakened it beyond the point of safe operation. But the greatest danger came from the rats' interactions with the ovens themselves. The brick structures provided warm, dry places for the creatures to nest, and they often built elaborate tunnel systems within the oven walls. These tunnels could compromise the structural integrity of the ovens, leading to partial collapses that could kill or seriously injure workers. They also provided pathways for flames to spread in unexpected directions, turning controlled fires into uncontrollable infernos. Thomas had witnessed one such disaster at a bakery in Whitechapel 3 years earlier. A colony of rats had extensively damaged the interior walls of the main oven, creating gaps that allowed superheated air to escape into the wooden framework of the building. The resulting fire had consumed not just the bakery, but the entire city block, killing 17 people and leaving dozens more homeless. Fire was the ultimate terror that haunted every Victorian baker. The combination of open flames, volatile chemicals, wooden construction, and poor ventilation created conditions where a single mistake could result in catastrophic destruction. The ovens burned at temperatures exceeding 500 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite virtually any combustible material that came too close. Coal dust, which accumulated throughout the bakery, was highly explosive when dispersed in the air. Even the flour itself could become dangerous under the right conditions. Fine particles of grain, suspended in hot air, could ignite with explosive force. Thomas had developed an almost paranoid awareness of fire hazards throughout the workspace. He knew exactly how close he could safely work to each oven opening, which tools were getting too hot to handle safely, and which areas of the floor had become dangerously slippery from accumulated grease and condensation. He had learnt to recognize the subtle changes in sound that indicated when an oven damper was not functioning properly, potentially allowing dangerous gases to accumulate. The primitive firefighting equipment available in 1850s London was largely useless against bakery fires. Hand-pumped fire engines could deliver water to the scene. But by the time they arrived, fires in flour-dusted environments had usually spread too far to be controlled. The narrow streets and closely packed buildings of working-class neighborhoods meant that fires often jumped from structure to structure before any organized response could be mounted. Insurance was theoretically available for bakery owners, but the premiums were so high that most small operations simply accepted the risk of total loss. This economic reality meant that safety precautions were often viewed as unnecessary expenses rather than essential protections. Proper ventilation systems, fire-resistant construction materials, and adequate emergency exits were luxuries that few bakeries could afford. The human cost of these risks was measured not just in dramatic fires and explosions, but in the daily toll of chronic exposure to dangerous conditions. Thomas knew at least a dozen bakers who had suffered serious burns from oven accidents. Several had lost fingers or hands to mixing equipment that lacked basic safety guards. Others had developed respiratory problems so severe that they could no longer work in the industry. Young apprentices were particularly vulnerable. They lacked the experience to recognize dangerous situations and were often assigned the most hazardous tasks precisely because their inexperience made them willing to take risks that older workers would avoid. Peter Milhouse, despite his youth, already showed signs of chronic lung damage from inhaling coal smoke and chemical dust. His persistent cough was getting worse, and Thomas had noticed that the boy occasionally coughed up blood after particularly strenuous work periods. The psychological effects of working under constant threat were perhaps the most insidious aspect of the bakery environment. Workers developed a kind of resigned fatalism, accepting that injury, illness, and premature death was simply the price of employment. This acceptance made them less likely to demand safer working conditions or to seek alternative employment, creating a cycle that perpetuated the dangerous practices. As Thomas shaped the morning's loaves, carefully working around the contaminated flour that had been mixed into the batch, he reflected on the strange contradiction of his profession. He was creating food that would sustain life, using methods that were slowly destroying his own health and the health of his customers. The bread that emerged from Hartwell's ovens was undeniably a peeling golden brown, fragrant and satisfying to hungry families throughout London. But it was also a slow-acting poison, contaminated with toxic chemicals, bacterial waste, and the decomposed remains of the rats that shared their workspace. The rats, the fires, the toxic chemicals, and the constant threat of injury or death had become so normalized in the baking industry that they were simply accepted as unavoidable aspects of the work. Workers who complained were replaced by others who were desperate enough to accept any employment, regardless of the risks. The system perpetuated itself through poverty, ignorance, and the simple fact that people needed bread to survive. In this environment, Thomas had learned to find meaning in small victories. A batch of loaves that came out particularly well. A day when no serious accidents occurred, or a moment when the ancient ovens operated smoothly and efficiently. These small satisfactions had to sustain him through the knowledge that his work was slowly killing him and contributing to the suffering of countless others who depended on his products for their daily sustenance. The apprentice system and child labor, the youngest worker at Hartwell's bakery, wasn't Peter Milhouse, despite his youthful appearance and trembling hands. That distinction belonged to Billy Ashworth, a boy of barely 12 years who had been indentured to William Hartwell just 3 months earlier. Billy's small frame made him ideal for certain tasks that larger workers couldn't. Perform crawling inside the brick ovens to scrape away built-up soot and creosote, squeezing into tight storage spaces to retrieve fallen flour sacks, and working in areas where a grown man's body simply wouldn't fit. Thomas Whitmore watched the boy struggle with a sack of flour that weighed nearly as much as he did, his thin arms shaking with the effort of lifting it onto the mixing table. Billy's parents had signed a 7-year indenture contract, trading their son's childhood for a promise that he would learn a trade and receive basic food and shelter. What they hadn't understood, because they couldn't read the fine print and had no lawyer to explain it to them, was that they had essentially sold their child into a form of legalized slavery. The apprenticeship system in Victorian England was supposed to provide young people with valuable skills and a path to economic independence. In practice, it was often a brutal exploitation of child labor, dressed up in the respectable language of education and opportunity. Boys as young as 10 were bound by contracts that gave their masters almost absolute authority over their lives, with minimal oversight and virtually no legal protections. Billy had been recruited from the Whitechapel workhouse, where his family had ended up after his father lost his job at a textile mill. The workhouse authorities were eager to reduce their burden by placing children in apprenticeships, and they weren't particularly concerned about the working conditions or the character of the masters who took them on. William Hartwell had paid a small fee to secure Billy's services, plus the cost of basic clothing and the promise to provide minimal food and shelter. The boy's daily routine began at 3 in the morning, an hour before even Thomas arrived at the bakery. His first task was to rekindle the fires in all 4 ovens, a dangerous job that required crawling part way into each brick chamber while the coals were still glowing. From the previous day's work, the temperature inside the ovens could reach 200 degrees Fahrenheit even when they weren't actively burning, hot enough to cause severe burns if Billy slipped or lost his balance. The coal that Billy used to restart the fires was stored in a cellar beneath the bakery, accessible only through a narrow hatch that required climbing down a rickety wooden ladder in complete darkness. The coal dust in this cellar was so thick that it formed a visible cloud when disturbed, and Billy often emerged coughing violently, his face and clothing black with soot. The long-term effects of inhaling coal dust were well known: a wasting disease called black lung that left its victims struggling for breath until their eventual death. But child apprentices were considered expendable once the fires were burning properly. Billy's next responsibility was to begin preparing the workspace for the day's baking. This involved sweeping flour, dust, coal, ash, and rat droppings from every surface, a task that seemed futile given the constant accumulation of debris. The primitive brooms available left much to be desired, often spreading contamination rather than removing it. But appearances had to be maintained for the occasional customer who ventured into the basement. The mixing of ingredients was where Billy's small size became both an advantage and a source of considerable danger. The wooden mixing troughs were large enough that he could climb inside them to ensure thorough combining of flour, water, and chemical additives. But this meant that his entire body was exposed to the toxic dust and fumes, with no protection beyond his thin cotton clothing. His hands, arms, and legs were constantly coated with the mixture of alum, chalk, and other adulterants that formed the basis of London's bread supply. Thomas had watched several apprentices over the years develop severe skin conditions from this exposure. The chemicals caused burns, rashes, and eventually permanent scarring that marked them as bakery workers for life. Billy was already showing early inflamed patches on his forearms where the alum concentration was highest, and a persistent rash around his mouth and nose from inhaling chemical dust. The boy's living conditions were barely better than those of the workhouse he had left behind. He slept on a straw mattress in a corner of the basement, surrounded by flour sacks and the constant noise of rats scurrying through the walls. His bedding was changed infrequently, and the dampness of the underground space meant that mold grew readily on any organic material. The air he breathed while sleeping was the same toxic mixture of coal smoke, chemical fumes, and flour dust that he inhaled during working hours. Food for apprentices was whatever could be scraped together from the bakery's operations. Burnt or damaged loaves that couldn't be sold provided the bulk of Billy's diet, supplemented occasionally with scraps from Hartwell's own meals. The bread that formed his primary sustenance contained all the same toxic additives that went into the commercial products, meaning that Billy was being slowly poisoned by the very food that was supposed to keep him alive. The educational component of Billy's apprenticeship was minimal at best. He was supposed to learn the skills of baking, but in practice, he was used primarily for the most dangerous and unpleasant tasks that the paid workers preferred to avoid. Instead of learning to judge oven temperatures or mix dough properly, he spent most of his time cleaning up contamination, hauling heavy materials, and performing maintenance on equipment that was often unsafe for adult workers, let alone children. William Hartwell justified this arrangement by claiming that Billy was learning discipline and work ethic, valuable qualities that would serve him throughout his life. But the reality was that the boy was being used as cheap labor, performing work that would have cost significantly more if done by adult employees. The 7-year term of his indenture meant that Hartwell could extract years of labor for the minimal cost of basic survival necessities. The legal protections for apprentices were theoretical at best, while contracts specified certain obligations on the part of masters' provision of food, shelter, and instruction enforcement was practically non-existent. Factory inspectors occasionally visited larger industrial operations, but small bakeries, like Hartwell's, were rarely subject to oversight. Even when abuses were reported, the legal system generally favored the masters, who had both economic resources and social connections that apprentices and their families lacked. Physical punishment was not only accepted but expected as part of the training process. Billy had already endured numerous beatings for minor infractions, spilling flour, moving too slowly, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. When Hartwell was having a bad day, these beatings were justified as necessary discipline, designed to teach the boy proper respect and work habits. In reality, they were often expressions of frustration by adults who were themselves trapped in a system that offered little opportunity for advancement or improvement. The psychological effects on child apprentices were profound and lasting. Boys who entered the system at ages 10 or 12 emerged as young men who had never known childhood, play, or the kind of education that might have offered them alternatives to industrial labor. They learned to accept abuse, danger, and exploitation as normal aspects of life, making them ideal workers for an industrial system that required a steady supply of compliant labor. Thomas had tried on several occasions to intervene when Hartwell's treatment of Billy became particularly harsh, but his efforts were limited by his own precarious position. As a journeyman baker without ownership stake in the business, Thomas could be dismissed at any time if he became too troublesome. His own family's survival depended on his continued employment, making it difficult to take risks on behalf of an apprentice he barely knew. The broader social context that made child labor acceptable was rooted in economic necessity and moral assumptions about the nature of poverty. Working-class families often had no choice but to indenture their children, as their own wages were insufficient to support entire households. The alternative, watching children starve in workhouses or on the streets, seemed worse than subjecting them to dangerous working conditions. Middle-class reformers occasionally raised concerns about child labor, but their efforts were undermined by the fundamental economic structure of industrial capitalism. Businesses that refused to exploit child labor found themselves unable to compete with those that did, creating a race to the bottom in terms of working conditions and wages. Even well-intentioned employers were trapped in a system that rewarded the most ruthless exploitation of human resources. Apprenticeship system also served to normalize the idea that workers should be grateful for any employment, regardless of conditions. Boys who survived their indentures emerged with the understanding that work was inherently dangerous and unpleasant, and that complaining about conditions was both futile and ungrateful. This psychological conditioning created a workforce that was unlikely to organize for better conditions or challenge the authority of employers. Religious and moral arguments were often used to justify the exploitation of child apprentices. Poverty was frequently attributed to moral failings rather than economic circumstances, making the suffering of working-class children seem like a natural consequence of their families' supposed inadequacies. Hard work, even under dangerous conditions, was portrayed as character-building and morally beneficial, regardless of its effects on physical health or psychological development. The medical understanding of child development was primitive by modern standards, but even contemporary physicians recognized that the working conditions in places like Hartwell's bakery were harmful to growing bodies. Children's lungs were more susceptible to damage from coal smoke and chemical fumes. Their developing bones and muscles were particularly vulnerable to injury from heavy labor and repetitive motions. Their nervous systems were more easily damaged by exposure to toxic substances like lead and mercury. Despite this knowledge, economic pressures consistently overrode health concerns. Factory owners, bakery masters, and other employers argued that regulation of child labor would destroy their ability to compete in the marketplace. Government officials, many of whom had financial interests in industrial enterprises, were reluctant to impose restrictions that might reduce profitability. As Thomas watched Billy struggle through another day of dangerous, toxic labor, he was struck by the cruel irony of the situation. The boy was working to produce food that would feed other children throughout London, but the process was slowly destroying his own health and development. The bread that emerged from their ovens would sustain families, but it was created through methods that consumed the lives and futures of the workers who made it possible. The apprenticeship system represented industrial capitalism at its most ruthless, a mechanism for extracting maximum value from human beings while providing minimal compensation and protection. Children like Billy were not students or trainees. They were cheap labor, their youth and vulnerability making them ideal for the most dangerous and unpleasant aspects of industrial production in the broader context of Victorian society. Billy's suffering was both invisible and essential. The bread that London's citizens consumed daily was made possible by the sacrifice of children whose names would never be remembered and whose contributions would never be acknowledged. They were the hidden cost of industrial progress. Their shortened lives and damaged health, part of the price paid for cheap food and profitable businesses. Lungs of coal and bread. Thomas Whitmore's morning cough had changed over the past year. What once began as a simple clearing of the throat had evolved into a violent, wrenching spasm that doubled him over and left him gasping for air. This morning, as he bent over the mixing trough, the familiar sensation began in his chest a tightening, followed by the irresistible urge to expel whatever had accumulated in his lungs during the night. The first cough produced nothing but air. The second brought up a small amount of clear mucus. By the fourth or fifth convulsion, Thomas was spitting up thick, black phlegm that splattered onto the flour-dusted floor. He had learned to turn away from the mixing bowls during these episodes, though the contamination of the workspace was hardly his primary concern. Peter Milhouse, working at the adjacent table, didn't even look up. Every baker in London experienced the same symptoms, and acknowledging them would only serve as an uncomfortable reminder of their shared fate. The black lung, as the workers called it, was as much a part of the profession as flour-dusted aprons and burns from oven handles. Dr. Edmund Hartley, a physician who occasionally treated workers from the industrial districts, had tried to explain the mechanism by which coal, smoke, and flour dust destroyed human lungs. The tiny particles, he said, were too small for the body's natural defenses to filter out effectively. They penetrated deep into the lung tissue, where they accumulated over months and years, causing inflammation and scarring that gradually reduced the organ's ability to transfer oxygen to the blood. But medical explanations meant little to men who had no choice but to continue breathing the toxic air that surrounded them. Thomas knew that his lungs were being destroyed, just as he knew that the chemicals in the flour were slowly poisoning his blood and the heat from the ovens was damaging his skin and eyes. Knowledge without alternatives was simply another burden to bear, the air inside. Hartwell's bakery was a complex mixture of hazardous substances. Coal smoke provided the base layer cocktail of carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and dozens of other combustion products that turned the air grey and gave it a sharp, acrid taste. Mixed with this were particles of flour, which might seem harmless but became dangerous when inhaled in large quantities over extended periods. Flour dust could trigger severe allergic reactions in sensitive individuals and could cause a condition called baker's lung, characterized by chronic inflammation and progressive scarring. The chemical additives used in bread production added their own toxic contributions to the atmosphere. Alum, when heated, released aluminum compounds that could be absorbed through the lungs and accumulate in the brain and other organs. Chalk dust, much of it contaminated with lead and other heavy metals, created a fine powder that coated every surface and was impossible to avoid inhaling. The various acids used to improve flour reactions produced vapors that burned the throat and damaged the delicate tissues of the respiratory system. Ventilation in most Victorian bakeries was minimal at best. Windows, if they existed, were often kept closed to prevent drafts that might affect oven temperatures or contaminate ingredients. The single chimney that served Hartwell's for ovens was inadequate for removing the volume of smoke and fumes produced, especially when the wind direction was unfavorable. On still days, the smoke accumulated in the basement until visibility was reduced to just a few feet. Thomas had learned to work by feel and sound as much as by sight. The consistent texture of properly mixed dough, the subtle changes in oven noise that indicated temperature fluctuations, and the distinctive smell that preceded a batch of bread burning were all more reliable indicators than visual observation through the smoky air. His other senses had become hypersensitive to compensate for the frequent periods when the air was too thick to see clearly. The long-term effects of this daily exposure were visible throughout London's baking community. Men in their 30s walked with the stooped postures and labored breathing of much older individuals. Chronic coughs were so common that silence in a room full of bakers was actually unusual. Many developed a distinctive grey pallor, as if their skin had absorbed some of the coal smoke that filled their working environment. William Hartwell himself, despite being the owner rather than a hands-on worker, showed clear signs of respiratory damage from his years in the trade. His breathing was audible across the basement, a wheezing, rattling sound that suggested significant obstruction in his airways. He had developed the habit of pausing frequently during conversations to catch his breath, and his once booming voice had been reduced to a raspy whisper that barely carried above the noise of the ovens. The progression of lung disease among bakers followed a predictable pattern. The first stage involved persistent coughing and the production of increasingly thick, discolored sputum. Workers learned to recognize the different colors and textures that indicated various stages of lung damage. Clear mucus was relatively harmless. Yellow or green suggested infection. Black indicated heavy coal dust accumulation. Red meant bleeding from damaged lung tissue. The second stage brought shortness of breath during physical exertion. Tasks that had once been easy lifting flour sacks, kneading large batches of dough, working near the intense heat of the ovens, became increasingly difficult. Workers found themselves pausing frequently to rest, their hearts racing as they struggled to get enough oxygen from their damaged lungs. By the third stage, breathing difficulties occurred even at rest. Men who had once been strong enough to work 16-hour shifts found themselves unable to climb stairs without stopping to rest. Sleep became difficult, as lying flat made breathing even more labored. Many workers developed the habit of sleeping propped up on multiple pillows or even sitting upright in chairs. The final stage was essentially a slow suffocation. The scarred lung tissue could no longer transfer adequate oxygen to the blood, and the heart worked harder and harder to compensate until it too began to fail. Death, when it came, was often welcomed as a release from the constant struggle to breathe. Thomas had watched several fellow bakers progress through these stages. Old Henry Walsh, who had worked at Mitchell's Bakery for over 20 years, had been forced to retire when he could no longer lift flour sacks without collapsing from exhaustion. He lived now on charity from his former co-workers, spending his days sitting by his window, gasping for air and coughing up blood-tinged phlegm. Young apprentices like Billy Ashworth were particularly vulnerable to lung damage because their respiratory systems were still developing. The toxic air that might take years to permanently damage an adult's lungs could cause irreversible harm to a child in a matter of months. Billy's persistent cough had already deepened, from the high-pitched wheeze of a boy to something closer to the harsh bark of an adult smoker. The medical profession's understanding of occupational lung diseases was limited but growing. Progressive physicians like Dr. Hartley had begun documenting the connection between states' industrial work environments and specific patterns of respiratory illness. Their research showed that bakers, coal miners, textile workers, and others exposed to airborne particles developed similar lung conditions. suggesting that the damage was caused by the work environment rather than moral failings or constitutional weaknesses. But medical knowledge had little practical impact on working conditions. Factory owners and bakery masters argued that regulation would destroy their competitiveness and put workers out of jobs entirely. Government officials, many with financial interests in industrial enterprises, were reluctant to impose restrictions that might reduce profits. Even workers themselves sometimes resisted safety improvements, fearing that the costs would be passed on to them through reduced wages or increased competition for jobs. The primitive protective equipment available offered little real protection. Some workers wrapped cloth around their faces, but the coarse material did little to filter out the finest particles, which were also the most dangerous. Wealthier establishments occasionally invested in mechanical ventilation systems, but these were expensive to install and maintain, and their effectiveness was limited by the primitive technology available. The economic calculations were stark. A baker who refused to work in toxic conditions would be replaced by someone desperate enough to accept any employment. The constant supply of workers from rural areas, displaced by agricultural changes, and from workhouses, where conditions were even worse than most industrial jobs, meant that employers had little incentive to improve working conditions. Thomas had calculated his own life expectancy based on observation of older workers. If he continued in the bakery, he could expect perhaps another 10 to 15 years of gradually declining health, followed by a few years of invalidism before death. The alternative, leaving the trade, seemed impossible given his family's financial situation and his lack of skills that would transfer to other occupations. The social isolation that came with occupational lung disease was another burden that workers had to bear. The constant coughing, the black phlegm, and the increasingly labored breathing made bakers unwelcome in many social situations. Potential employers in other industries recognized the signs of industrial lung disease and refused to hire workers who might become disabled and unable to work, even within families. The effects of occupational lung disease created strain and hardship. Wives found themselves taking on additional work to compensate for their husbands' declining earning capacity. Children grew up understanding that their father's health was slowly failing, and that the family's economic security was precarious. The knowledge that breadwinners were literally sacrificing their lives for their families' survival created psychological burdens that extended far beyond the workplace. The bread that emerged from this toxic environment carried with it the literal breath of the men who made it. Every loaf was infused with coal, smoke, flour, dust, and the various chemical vapors that filled the bakery. Customers who praised the distinctive flavor of their neighborhood baker's products were actually tasting the industrial poisoning that was slowly killing the workers who served them. As Thomas shaped the morning's loaves, his hands working automatically while his mind wandered, he reflected on the strange intimacy between his failing lungs and the bread that London's citizens would consume for breakfast. His labored breathing, the black particles that he coughed up each morning, and the gradually declining capacity of his respiratory system were all part of the hidden cost of industrial food production. The irony was not lost on him that he spent his days creating sustenance for others while his own body was being systematically destroyed by his work environment. Every breath he took in service of feeding London's population was a breath that brought him closer to the slow suffocation that awaited all career bakers. His lungs, blackened with coal dust and scarred by chemical exposure, were gradually being transformed from organs of life into monuments to industrial progress. Yet he continued to work, because the alternative watching his family starve seemed worse than the certain knowledge that his profession was killing him. In the complex calculus of survival in Victorian London, a slow death by lung disease was preferable to the quick death by starvation that awaited those who couldn't find steady employment. The bread had to be made. London had to be fed, and someone had to sacrifice their health to make it possible. Thomas Whitmore and his fellow bakers were paying that price, one labored breath at a time. Weapons of war made of bread by noon on most days. Hartwell's bakery had produced enough bread to feed several hundred families. But the real test of quality came not from taste or appearance, but from durability. Victorian bread was expected to last, and last it did often to an extent that defied both logic and digestive capability. Thomas Whitmore had witnessed customers use week-old loaves as children employ stale rolls as projectiles in street games, and desperate housewives wield crusty baguettes as clubs against persistent rats. The transformation from food to weapon was not intentional, but it was inevitable. The combination of chemical additives, minimal moisture content, and baking techniques designed for shelf life rather than palatability created bread that could serve multiple purposes beyond nutrition. Fresh from the oven, a loaf might be soft and appealing. Within 48 hours, it had achieved the consistency of hardwood. By the end of a week, it could legitimately be classified as a bludgeoning instrument. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, a regular customer who lived in the tenements above Whitechapel Road, had developed a reputation in the neighborhood for her creative use of past-due bread products. Thomas had watched her examine loaves with the calculating eye of a military engineer, testing their weight and balance before making her selections. She purchased dialed bread not because it was cheaper, though the reduced price was certainly a factor, but because she had discovered its effectiveness in home defense. The previous month, Mrs. Pemberton had successfully repelled a burglar using nothing more than a 3D-oed cottage loaf, an impressive accuracy acquired through years of throwing household objects at her husband during domestic disputes. The intruder had been found the next morning by constables, unconscious and sporting a knot on his forehead that perfectly matched the rounded end of a standard bakery loaf. The incident had become legendary in the neighborhood, inspiring other housewives to stockpile aging bread for similar purposes. Children, with their natural instinct for turning anything into ammunition, had long ago discovered the military potential of Victorian baked goods. The narrow alleys behind the bakery regularly echoed with the sound of crusty rolls bouncing off brick walls and wooden shutters. Young Billy Ashworth, during his brief breaks from bakery duties, had organized neighborhood boys into competing armies, each side equipped with rejected loaves and dialed pastries. These bread wars were more serious than they might have appeared to casual observers. A well-aimed dinner roll could raise a substantial welt, and larger loaves were capable of causing genuine injury. Thomas had treated more than one apprentice for wounds inflicted by weaponized baked goods, and the local constabulary had learned to investigate. Reports of children throwing stones with the understanding that the projectiles were more likely to be edible. At least in theory. The physics of stale bread made it surprisingly effective as a defensive weapon. The chemical additives that preserved it also made it incredibly dense, while the hard crust provided structural integrity that prevented the loaf from crumbling on impact. A properly stale baguette could deliver a blow comparable to a wooden club, with the additional advantage that it left behind evidence that could theoretically be consumed, eliminating the proof of the assault. Professional prize fighters in London's underground boxing scene had begun incorporating stale bread into their training regimens. The weight and unpredictable balance of aging loaves made them excellent tools for developing hand-eye coordination and defensive reflexes. Fighters who could consistently dodge a barrage of crusty rolls found that avoiding human opponents became considerably easier. The bread's transformation from sustenance to armament was aided by the same factors that made it slowly toxic to consume. The alum that provided whiteness also acted as a hardening agent, creating a chemical reaction that continued even after baking was complete. Over time, loaves became progressively denser and more solid, eventually achieving a consistency that rivaled fired clay chalk. Originally added to bulk up flour and improve appearance, contributed structural strength that made older bread remarkably durable. Thomas had observed loaves that had been dropped from significant heights without breaking, and had seen day-old rolls survive being trampled by horses with minimal damage. The same durability that made Victorian bread unsuitable for human consumption made it excellent for construction purposes. Some enterprising citizens had begun using extremely stale bread as building material. The compressed, chemically hardened loaves could be stacked to create temporary barriers, used as foundation material for small structures, or even incorporated into mortar as an aggregate. The bread's resistance to moisture, enhanced by its chemical composition, made it surprisingly effective for these applications. Military applications were inevitable. British soldiers stationed in colonial outposts had discovered that hardtack and other military bread, already notorious for its toughness, could be improved through the addition of civilian baking additives. Alum-enhanced field rations lasted longer, traveled better, and in extreme situations could serve double duty as improvised weapons or construction materials. The Royal Navy had conducted unofficial experiments with using stale civilian bread as ballast for smaller vessels. The bread's density and water resistance made it suitable for this purpose, with the theoretical advantage that it could be consumed in emergencies, though the definition of emergency required to make Victorian bread palatable remained a matter of debate. Thomas had heard stories from merchant sailors who claimed that certain types of preserved bread could be used to patch holes in wooden hulls during rough weather. The bread would swell when exposed to water, creating a temporary seal that could keep a ship afloat long enough to reach port for proper repairs. Whether these stories were true or merely nautical folklore was unclear, but the fact that they were considered plausible spoke to the remarkable durability of industrially produced baked goods. The weaponization of bread had created an unexpected market for bakery products that were well past their intended consumption date. Street vendors purchased week-old loaves at steep discounts and resold them to customers who specifically wanted bread for non-nutritional purposes. These utility loaves were advertised for rat control, home defense, and children's entertainment, with the understanding that consumption was neither expected nor recommended. Law enforcement had begun to take notice of bread-related violence. Constables reported an increasing number of domestic disputes that involved the throwing of baked goods, and several serious assaults had been committed using loaves as weapons. The legal system struggled to classify these incidents. Was attacking someone with bread a form of assault, or merely an innovative form of food fight? The courts had established precedent that bread could indeed be considered a weapon if used with intent to cause harm. This legal recognition had led to some unusual criminal cases, including one memorable trial where a defendant was charged with assault with a deadly dinner roll after knocking a rival unconscious. During a dispute over market stall placement, insurance companies had begun including bread-related property damage in their standard policies after a series of incidents where stale loaves had broken windows, damaged furniture, and in one notable case, knocked a chimney pot loose from a roof. The adjusters who investigated these claims initially dismissed them as fraudulent, but physical evidence consistently supported them. Victims' accounts of destruction caused by airborne baked goods the medical profession had documented. Numerous injuries caused by bread-based weapons. Dr. Hartley, the physician who treated workers from industrial districts, had compiled case studies of fractures, concussions, and severe bruising caused by impacts from stale loaves. His research suggested that Victorian bread, when properly aged, could deliver blunt force trauma comparable to traditional weapons. The transformation of bread into weaponry represented a peculiar form of value engineering. Products that had failed in their primary purpose, nutrition, could still serve secondary functions that generated income and utility. Bakers like Thomas found themselves in the unusual position of creating products that became more valuable as they became less edible. The social implications of weaponized bread were complex and troubling. In a society where hunger was common and food insecurity affected large portions of the population, the fact that bread could become too dangerous to eat while still being useful for violence seemed to capture something essential about the contradictions of industrial capitalism. Children growing up in neighborhoods where bread fights were common developed a complicated relationship with food. They learned to see baked goods not just as sustenance, but as potential ammunition, tools, and construction materials. This utilitarian approach to nutrition reflected broader social attitudes about the relationship between necessity and safety. The industrial processes that made bread toxic also made it durable, creating a product that could serve multiple functions in households where versatility was essential for survival. A single loaf might provide several meals when fresh, serve as a weapon or tool when stale, and eventually be used as fuel for fires when it became completely inedible. The export of British baking techniques to colonial territories had introduced weaponized bread to cultures that had never experienced food as a form of armament. Colonial administrators reported confusion among local populations who could not understand why the British would create food that was more suitable for warfare than consumption. Thomas often reflected on the strange trajectory of his products as he watched customers make their selections. A housewife might choose a fresh loaf for her family's dinner and an older one for protection against intruders. A mother might buy soft rolls for her infant and hard ones for her older children to use in street games. The same skills that allowed him to create nourishing bread also enabled him to manufacture weapons, tools, and construction materials. The dual nature of Victorian bread, simultaneously food and armament, reflected the broader contradictions of industrial society. Technology that promised to improve human life often created new problems and dangers. Progress that solved old challenges frequently generated entirely new categories of hazards. The bread that emerged from Hartwell's ovens embodied these contradictions, serving as both sustenance and threat, nourishment and weapon, comfort and danger. As Thomas shaped the afternoon's loaves, he wondered whether future generations would find ways to make bread that was both safe to eat and too soft to use as ammunition. The idea seemed almost fantastical, like imagining food that was purely nutritional without any secondary applications. But perhaps, in some distant future, bread would be just bread, neither poison nor projectile, but simply sustenance for those who needed it. The poisoning of London the morning brought news that would haunt Thomas Whitmore for the rest of his shortened life. Dr. Edmund Hartley arrived at the bakery just after 8 o'clock, his black medical bag in one hand and a grim expression that spoke of sleepless nights and terrible discoveries. He had been investigating what he called the Whitechapel incidents, a series of mysterious illnesses that had struck several families in the neighborhood over the past month. "Mr. Whitmore," Dr. Hartley said, his voice carrying the weight of unwelcome knowledge, "I need to speak with you about the bread you've been producing, and I'm afraid what I've learned will disturb you greatly." Thomas set down his mixing paddle and wiped flour-dusted hands on his apron, though the action provided little comfort. He had been expecting this conversation for months, dreading the moment when someone with medical knowledge would connect the dots between the bakery's ingredients and the health problems that plagued their customers. Dr. Hartley opened his bag and withdrew a collection of small glass vials, each containing samples of bread from various bakeries throughout London. Some samples were white as fresh snow, others had a greyish tint, and a few showed disturbing discolorations that suggested contamination. Beyond the usual adulterants, "I've been testing bread samples from 43 different bakeries," Dr. Hartley explained, arranging the vials on the flour-dusted work surface. "What I've found is nothing short of systematic poisoning. Every single sample contains substances that have no business being consumed by human beings." The doctor selected one vial containing bread from Hartwell's bakery. Under magnification, he explained, the sample revealed not just alum and chalk, but traces of arsenic, lead, mercury, and several other toxic compounds. The sources of these contaminants were varied. Some came from the chemical additives themselves, others from the contaminated water supply, and still more from the industrial processes used to prepare flour and other ingredients. "The Whitechapel incidents," Dr. Hartley continued, "involve 3 families who have been consuming bread from this establishment for over a year. The symptoms are consistent with chronic heavy metal poisoning, neurological problems, digestive disorders, anemia, and in the case of the youngest children, developmental delays that may be permanent." Thomas felt his stomach drop as the doctor described the victims. The Morrison family, a husband, wife, and 4 children who lived just 2 streets away. The Clarks, elderly pensioners who bought their daily bread from Hartwell's without fail. The Ashfords, a young couple with twin infants who had been feeding their babies softened bread soaked in milk. The Morrison children, aged 3 through 10, had all developed what their parents attributed to childhood misbehavior and slow development. But Dr. Hartley's examinations revealed symptoms of lead and arsenic poisoning, delayed speech, difficulty with coordination, and behavioral problems that stemmed from damaged nervous systems, rather than moral failings. Mrs. Clark had been suffering from severe digestive problems that left her unable to keep food down. Her husband showed signs of kidney damage that Dr. Hartley traced to chronic aluminum exposure from the alum used in bread production. Both elderly people had attributed their declining health to natural aging, never suspecting that their daily bread was slowly poisoning them. Most disturbing were the Ashford twins, now 8 months old. They had failed to reach normal developmental milestones, showing signs of cognitive impairment that Dr. Hartley believed resulted from consuming contaminated bread through their mother's milk and through the softened bread they had been fed directly. "The tragedy," Dr. Hartley said, his voice thick with emotion, is that these families trusted you to provide safe food for their children. They scraped together their pennies to buy bread, believing they were nourishing their families. Instead, they've been paying to have their children slowly poisoned. Thomas wanted to protest, to explain that he had no choice in the ingredients he used, that he was simply following industry practices that every bakery employed. But the words died in his throat as he looked at the evidence spread before him. The vials of contaminated bread, the medical reports documenting preventable suffering, and the knowledge that dozens of other families were experiencing similar problems made any excuse seem hollow and self-serving. The scope of the problem extended far beyond Hartwell's bakery. Dr. Hartley's research had documented widespread food adulteration throughout London's baking industry. Milk was watered down and whitened with chalk or plaster. Sugar was bulked up with sand and sawdust. Tea was mixed with dried leaves from other plants, some of which were toxic. Coffee was extended with ground acorns, chicory, and in some cases, roasted clay. But bread, as the staple food of working-class families, represented the most systematic and devastating form of poisoning. Poor families might buy milk or sugar occasionally, but they consumed bread daily, sometimes multiple times per day. Children, with their developing bodies and higher metabolism, were particularly vulnerable to the cumulative effects of the toxic additives. The economic incentives that drove food adulteration created a system where safety was sacrificed for profit at every level. Farmers sold grain contaminated with weeds and ergot fungus. Millers added cheap fillers to flour. Chemical suppliers sold industrial waste as food additives. Bakers used whatever ingredients they could afford, regardless of their effect on human health. And consumers, driven by poverty and ignorance, chose the cheapest available options without understanding the hidden costs. Government regulation of food safety was minimal and poorly enforced. The few laws that existed were written by legislators who often had financial interests in the industries they were supposed to regulate. Inspectors were underpaid, understaffed, and easily corrupted. When violations were discovered, the penalties were usually small fines that businesses treated as acceptable costs of doing business. The medical establishment was only beginning to understand the connection between food contamination and chronic illness. Many physicians still attributed diseases to bad air, moral failings, or constitutional weaknesses, rather than environmental causes. The idea that everyday food could be slowly poisoning entire populations was difficult for even educated professionals too. A CCEPT, Dr. Hartley, was part of a small group of reform-minded physicians who were documenting the health effects of industrial food production. Their research was methodical but faced considerable resistance from business interests and government officials who preferred not to acknowledge the extent of the problem. Publishing their findings was difficult, as many journals were reluctant to print articles that might damage profitable industries. The human cost of food adulteration was measured not just in dramatic cases of acute poisoning, but in the slow accumulation of chronic health problems that shortened lives and reduced quality of life for millions of people. Children who grew up consuming contaminated food developed learning disabilities, behavioral problems, and physical ailments that affected them for life. Adults experienced premature aging, chronic illnesses, and reduced life expectancy. The psychological effects were equally devastating. Families who discovered that they had been unknowingly poisoning their children experienced profound guilt and helplessness. Parents who had sacrificed to provide what they believed was nutritious food for their families learned that their efforts had actually harmed the people they were trying to protect. Thomas found himself confronting the moral dimensions of his work in ways he had previously avoided. He had always known that the ingredients he used were questionable, but he had convinced himself that everyone in the industry faced the same constraints. The alternative, refusing to use contaminated ingredients, seemed impossible given the economic pressures and competitive environment. But Dr. Hartley's evidence made it clear that Thomas and his fellow bakers were not simply victims of an unjust system. They were active participants in a process that was causing real harm to real people. Every loaf of bread that left Hartwell's bakery carried with it a burden of toxic substances that would accumulate in the bodies of his customers, contributing to their eventual illness and death. The doctor's visit marked a turning point in Thomas's understanding of his profession. He could no longer pretend that he was simply a craftsman creating food for his community. He was part of an industrial system that prioritized profit over human health, treating consumers as sources of revenue rather than as people deserving protection from harm. The weight of this knowledge was almost unbearable. Thomas had entered the baking trade with pride, seeing himself as someone who provided an essential service to his community. He had taken satisfaction in his skill at creating bread that satisfied customers and supported his family. But now he understood that his expertise was being used to harm the very people he had thought he was serving. The families affected by contaminated bread had no recourse through the legal system. They lacked the resources to hire lawyers, and the courts were generally unsympathetic to claims against established businesses. The cost of pursuing justice was beyond their means, and the likelihood of success was minimal. They were left to deal with the consequences of poisoning while the systems that had harmed them continued to operate unchanged. Dr. Hartley's research would eventually contribute to food safety reforms, but those changes would come too late for the current generation of victims. The children who had already been damaged by contaminated food would carry the effects for the rest of their lives. The adults who had developed chronic illnesses would continue to suffer from conditions that proper food safety could have prevented. As Thomas returned to his work after Dr. Hartley's departure, he found himself unable to maintain the emotional distance that had previously allowed him to function in the toxic environment of the bakery. Every handful of flour contaminated with chemical additives, every measure of water drawn from polluted sources, and every loaf that emerged from the smoke-filled ovens represented not just a product, but a contribution to the suffering of people who trusted him to provide safe food. The bread he made would be consumed by families who believed they were nourishing their children. Parents would watch their sons and daughters grow up with preventable health problems, never understanding that their daily bread had been a slow-acting poison. The knowledge of his role in this process would haunt Thomas for the rest of his life, adding psychological suffering to the physical deterioration that his work environment was already causing. London was being poisoned one loaf at a time, and Thomas Whitmore had spent 8 years as an unwitting accomplice in one of the greatest public health disasters in human history. Death in the oven, the explosion, happened at 20 minutes past 2 on a Tuesday afternoon that had begun like any other. Thomas Whitmore was pulling a batch of loaves from the second oven when he heard Peter Milhouse scream, not the usual curse that followed a minor burn or dropped tool, but a sound of pure terror that cut through the basement's constant din of crackling fires and grinding machinery. Thomas spun around to see Peter trapped waist-deep in the mixing trough, his arms flailing as he struggled against something that was pulling him deeper into the wooden vat. What should have been a routine cleaning of the large vessel had become a nightmare when the accumulated residue of chemical additives, mixed with water and fermented grain particles, had created a substance with the consistency of quicksand. The mixture that held Peter was not simply dough gone wrong. Years of chemical buildup, loam, plaster, lead compounds, and organic matter in various stages of decomposition had created a toxic soup that seemed to have developed its own malevolent properties. The more Peter struggled, the deeper he sank into the viscous mass that was now approaching his chest. "Help me," Peter gasped, his voice already strained from the pressure the substance was putting on his ribcage. I can't get out." Thomas dropped his oven paddle and rushed to the mixing trough. But as he reached for Peter's outstretched hands, young Billy Ashworth shouted a warning from across the basement. "Mr. Thomas, the third oven. Something's wrong with the third oven." The brick structure was glowing with an intensity that Thomas had never seen before. The usual red-orange heat had given way to a brilliant white light that hurt to look at directly. More alarming was the sound, a high-pitched whining that suggested the very structure of the oven was under extreme stress. "The dampers stuck," Billy yelled, his 12-year-old voice cracking with fear. "I can't get it to move." Thomas found himself facing an impossible choice. Peter was sinking deeper into the chemical quicksand with each passing second, his breathing becoming increasingly labored as the toxic mixture pressed against his lungs. But the overheating oven represented a threat to everyone in the basement if the structure failed catastrophically. The explosion could bring down the entire building. He grabbed a wooden paddle and tried to use it as a lever to help extract Peter from the trough, but the handle snapped under the strain. The chemical mixture had achieved a consistency that seemed designed to trap anything that entered it, creating suction that worked against any rescue efforts. "Billy," Thomas shouted, "get upstairs and tell Mr. Hartwell to send for help. And stay up there, don't come back down no matter what you hear." The boy hesitated for a moment, torn between obedience and concern for his fellow workers, then scrambled up the stone steps toward street level. His departure left Thomas alone with Peter, who was now trapped up to his armpits in the toxic substance. The overheating oven had begun to affect the air quality in the basement. The intense heat was causing chemical reactions among the various additives and contaminants that coated every surface of the workspace. Fumes that were normally merely unpleasant became actively dangerous as temperatures exceeded the breaking points of various compounds. Thomas could taste metal in his mouth, sign that lead. Particles were being vaporized by the extreme heat. His eyes began to water uncontrollably as mercury vapor, released from contaminated flour dust, reached toxic concentrations in the air. The familiar smell of baking bread was overwhelmed by the acrid stench of burning chemicals. Peter wheezed, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. I don't think I'm going to make it out of this." The young man's resignation was heartbreaking, but Thomas refused to give up. He tried using his own body weight as leverage, wrapping his arms around Peter's shoulders and pulling with all his strength. For a moment, it seemed like the suction might be weakening, but then Peter screamed in agony, "Stop! You're tearing me apart." The chemical mixture had created a seal around Peter's lower body that was impossible to break without causing severe injury. The toxic substances had reacted with his clothing and skin, creating bonds that were stronger than the fabric itself. Any attempt to extract him by force would likely result in devastating wounds that would kill him even if the rescue succeeded. The third oven chose that moment to fail catastrophically. The whining sound reached a crescendo, followed by a thunderous crack as the superheated bricks began to split. Chunks of masonry, glowing like coals, scattered across the basement floor, setting fire to flour sacks and wooden tools. The explosion, when it came, was not the dramatic blast that Thomas had feared. Instead, the oven seemed to collapse inward on itself, creating a vacuum that sucked air from throughout the basement. The sudden change in pressure affected everyone's breathing, but for Peter, trapped in the chemical mixture and already struggling for air, it was catastrophic. Thomas watched in horror as his young colleague's eyes rolled back and his body went limp. The toxic fumes, concentrated by the pressure change, had overwhelmed Peter's already compromised respiratory system. He was still alive, but barely conscious. His breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. The fire from the collapsed oven was spreading rapidly. Flour dust, when suspended in air and exposed to intense heat, became explosive. Thomas could see small flashes throughout the basement as pockets of dust ignited, creating a chain reaction that would soon engulf the entire workspace. He made one final attempt to free Peter, using a metal tool to try to break the suction around his trapped colleague. But the heat from the spreading fires was becoming unbearable, and the toxic fumes were making it difficult to think clearly. His vision was starting to blur, and his hands were shaking from chemical exposure. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered to the unconscious Peter, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry." He stumbled toward the stone steps, his lungs burning from the toxic air. Behind him, the fires continued to spread, consuming years of accumulated flour, dust, chemical residues, and organic matter. The basement had become a furnace that would burn for hours, destroying evidence of the dangerous practices that had made such disasters inevitable. Thomas emerged onto the street level to find a crowd gathering around the bakery. Billy Ashworth was crying hysterically, trying to explain to William Hartwell what had happened below. The bakery owner's face had gone white as he realized that his business, and quite possibly his life, was about to go up in smoke. The fire brigade arrived within minutes, but their hand-pumped engines were inadequate for a chemical fire of this magnitude. Water, when it hit the superheated surfaces, turned instantly to steam, carrying toxic vapors throughout the neighborhood. The firefighters, lacking any protection beyond wet cloth tied over their faces, were forced to retreat repeatedly as the fumes overwhelmed them. By evening, Hartwell's bakery was nothing but smoldering ruins. Peter Millhouse's body was never recovered. The intense heat had reduced everything in the basement to ash and twisted metal. The official cause of death was listed as industrial accident, a euphemism that revealed nothing about the dangerous practices that had made such accidents commonplace. The fire had also destroyed the evidence of food adulteration that Dr. Hartley had been documenting. The samples, records, and chemical analysis that might have led to reforms were reduced to nothing. Without proof of wrongdoing, the investigation into unsafe food practices was quietly abandoned. 3 other bakeries in London experienced similar disasters that year. Each was attributed to unfortunate accidents or acts of God rather than the systemic problems that made such catastrophes inevitable. The combination of toxic chemicals, inadequate ventilation, primitive safety equipment, and untrained workers created conditions where death was not a possibility but a certainty. The families of the victims received no compensation. Peter Millhouse's parents, who had hoped their son's apprenticeship would provide him with a secure future, were left with nothing but grief and the knowledge that their boy had died in one of the most horrible ways imaginable. They could not afford lawyers to pursue wrongful death claims, and the legal system was not sympathetic to workers who died in industrial accidents. Thomas found himself unemployed and unemployable. The fire had destroyed his tools, his references, and his reputation. Other bakery owners saw him as unlucky at best, and possibly responsible for the disaster that had killed his colleague. The skills he had spent 8 years developing were suddenly worthless, as no one wanted to hire a baker associated with such a catastrophic failure. The psychological trauma was worse than the economic hardship. Thomas was haunted by the memory of Peter's final moments, trapped and dying in a mixture of toxic chemicals while fires consumed everything around him. He woke up screaming from nightmares in which he was the one trapped in the chemical quicksand, feeling his life slowly crushed out of him while flames crept closer. His own health, already compromised by years of chemical exposure and coal smoke inhalation, deteriorated rapidly after the fire. The concentrated toxic fumes he had breathed during the disaster had caused permanent damage to his respiratory system. He could no longer walk upstairs without stopping to rest, and his persistent cough had developed into something that sounded like a death rattle. The broader implications of the disaster were ignored by authorities who preferred not to acknowledge the dangerous conditions in London's food production facilities. No new safety regulations were implemented. No inspections were mandated. No compensation was provided to victims' families. The industrial system that had killed Peter Milhouse continued to operate exactly as before, claiming new victims with predictable regularity. The bread that Londoners consumed the day after the fire was made using the same toxic ingredients, the same dangerous processes, and the same indifference to human safety that had characterized the industry for decades. The only difference was that one fewer baker was alive to witness the slow poisoning of his community. Thomas lived for 3 more years after the fire, gradually wasting away from the effects of chronic chemical poisoning. His death, when it came, was attributed to natural causes, though there was nothing natural about the industrial toxins that had destroyed his lungs, liver, and nervous system. He was buried in an unmarked grave in a pauper's cemetery, forgotten by a society that had used up his life and discarded him without a second thought. The basement where Peter Milhouse had died was eventually rebuilt and returned to service as a bakery. New workers, desperate for employment and ignorant of the site's history, mixed flour and chemicals in the same dangerous combinations that had killed their predecessors. The cycle of exploitation, poisoning, and death continued uninterrupted, as it would for decades to come. In the end, Peter's death had changed nothing except the lives of those who loved him. The system that had killed him remained intact, ready to claim new victims from the endless supply of workers who had no choice but to risk their lives for the privilege of slowly poisoning their neighbors. The slow death of the industry 3 years after the fire that claimed Peter Milhouse's life. The London baking industry was finally beginning to confront the consequences of decades of toxic practices. But change came not from compassion or regulation, but from the simple economic reality that dead customers could no longer purchase bread, and dying bakers could no longer produce it. Dr. Edmund Hartley had rebuilt his research from the ashes of Hartwell's bakery, this time working with a network of reform-minded physicians and chemists who had grown alarmed at the mounting evidence of widespread food poisoning. Their new study encompassed not just individual cases of illness, but the broader patterns of disease and death that characterized neighborhoods where contaminated. Bread was the dietary staple. The statistics were devastating. In working-class districts, where residents relied heavily on cheap white bread, child mortality rates were nearly double those in areas where people could afford better food. Life expectancy was shortened by an average of 15 years. Rates of mental illness, developmental disabilities, and chronic diseases were significantly higher than in comparable populations with access to uncontaminated food. Thomas Whitmore, now 41 years old but looking decades older, had become an unwitting case study in the long-term effects of occupational exposure to bakery toxins. His hair had turned completely grey and begun falling out in patches. His hands shook constantly, making fine motor tasks impossible. His breathing was so labored that he could barely walk a city block without stopping to rest. More troubling were the neurological symptoms that had developed over the past year. Thomas frequently found himself confused about basic facts the day of the week. The names of familiar people, the location of his own home. His wife Mary had noticed that he sometimes spoke to people who weren't there, carrying on conversations with Peter Milhouse and other deceased colleagues as if they were standing beside him. The medical profession was beginning to understand that the chemicals used in bread production could cross from the lungs into the bloodstream and eventually reach the brain. Lead and mercury, in particular, were known to cause progressive mental deterioration. That began with memory problems and eventually progressed to complete cognitive collapse. Dr. Hartley had documented dozens of cases among former bakery workers who exhibited similar symptoms. Men in their 30s and 40s were developing dementia-like conditions typically seen only in the very elderly. Some became violent and unpredictable as the toxic metals damaged the parts of their brains responsible for impulse control and emotional regulation. The social costs of these neurological injuries extended far beyond the affected individuals. Families struggled to care for men who had become dangerous to themselves and others. Women found themselves widowed in all but name. Their husbands transformed into unpredictable strangers who sometimes didn't recognize their own children. The economic burden was equally crushing. Men who could no longer work became dependent on families that were already struggling to survive. The poorhouses and charitable institutions were overwhelmed with former industrial workers who had been rendered unemployable by their occupational exposures. The same system that had profited from their labor now abandoned them to poverty and suffering. Meanwhile, the baking industry itself was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own toxicity. Experienced bakers were dying or becoming disabled faster than they could be replaced. The young men who might have been recruited as apprentices were increasingly reluctant to enter a trade that was obviously deadly. The shortage of skilled workers was forcing bakery owners to offer higher wages. But even desperate men were beginning to refuse employment that came with a virtual guarantee of premature death. The knowledge of what had happened to Thomas, Peter, and countless others had spread throughout London's working-class neighborhoods, making bakery workers feared as coal mining or chimney sweeping. Some enterprising bakery owners attempted to address the labor shortage by recruiting from more distant areas where knowledge of the industry's dangers had not yet spread. They sent agents to rural districts, promising young men steady employment and the chance to learn a respectable trade in the great city of London. But even these recruits, initially eager for opportunity, quickly recognized the reality of their situation. The visible health problems of their colleagues, the toxic working conditions, and the obvious connection between bakery employment and premature death made it impossible to maintain the illusion that this was desirable work. William Hartwell, who had rebuilt his bakery after the fire, found himself unable to maintain a stable workforce. Men would work for a few weeks or months, then disappear without notice when they realized what the job was doing to their health. Others would demand wages so high that they made the business unprofitable. The quality of bread production began to suffer as inexperienced workers made mistakes that more skilled craftsmen would have avoided. Loaves came out burned, undercooked, or contaminated with even more dangerous substances than usual. Customers complained about bread that made them violently ill immediately after consumption, rather than slowly poisoning them over months and years. The customer base itself was also changing. Middle-class families, armed with growing knowledge about food adulteration, began seeking alternatives to the white bread that had previously been considered a sign of prosperity and good taste. Some hired servants to bake bread at home using carefully sourced ingredients. Others patronized for few expensive bakeries that advertised their use of pure, unadulterated flour. Working-class families had fewer options, but were also becoming more suspicious of the cheapest bread available. Mothers who had watched their children develop mysterious illnesses began making connections between their families, diets, and their health problems. Even when they couldn't afford better alternatives, they started buying less bread overall, supplementing their families' diets with other foods when possible. The circle of knowledge about food contamination was expanding through informal networks of communication. Women shared observations about which bakeries seemed to produce the most harmful products. Families compared notes about their children's health problems and the foods they had been eating. Gradually, a grassroots awareness campaign emerged that was more effective than any official public health initiative. Dr. Hartley and his colleagues attempted to accelerate this process by publishing simplified guides to food safety that could be understood by people with limited education. They distributed pamphlets in working-class neighborhoods, explaining how to identify the most obvious signs of food adulteration and how to demand better quality from local merchants. But the fundamental economic structures that had created the problem remained unchanged. Poor families still needed cheap food to survive, and bakeries still needed to maximize profits to stay in business. As long as the cheapest bread was produced using the most toxic methods, market forces would continue to reward the most dangerous practices. The government's response to the mounting evidence of food-related illness was characterized by the same indifference that had allowed the problem to develop in the first place. A few token regulations were passed, mostly requiring better labeling of products rather than actually improving their safety. Enforcement remained minimal, and penalties for violations were too small to change business behavior. Some members of Parliament called for more comprehensive food safety legislation, but their efforts were consistently blocked by representatives who had financial interests in the food production industry. The same economic relationships that had created the problem now prevented any effective response to it. The press coverage of food adulteration scandals followed a predictable pattern. Initial outrage would be expressed about particularly egregious cases of contamination or illness. Investigations would be promised, and reform measures would be proposed. But public attention would quickly move on to other issues, and the promised changes would be quietly abandoned or watered down to the point of ineffectiveness. Thomas, in his increasingly confused mental state, sometimes believed that significant reforms had been implemented, and that the dangers he had faced were things of the past. On clearer days, he recognized that virtually nothing had changed except the number of victims and the sophistication of their suffering. The international reputation of British food products was beginning to suffer as reports of contamination and adulteration spread to other countries. Foreign buyers became reluctant to purchase British agricultural products, fearing that they might be adulterated with the same toxic substances that were poisoning British Consumers. This economic pressure provided some incentive for reform, but it was focused primarily on export products rather than food consumed domestically. British manufacturers began producing different versions of their products: clean versions for foreign markets and contaminated versions for domestic consumption. The technological capability to produce safe food existed, but the economic incentives remained aligned against its implementation. Clean production methods were more expensive, and businesses that adopted them found themselves unable to compete with those that continued using toxic shortcuts. As the 1860s progressed, the London baking industry had become trapped in a death spiral of its own making. The most experienced workers were dead or disabled. New recruits were increasingly difficult to find. Customers were becoming more aware of the dangers and more reluctant to purchase contaminated products. But the fundamental economic structures that had created these problems remained unchanged. Thomas Whitmore, approaching the end of his shortened life, had become a living symbol of an industry that was consuming itself. His deteriorating mind and failing body represented the ultimate cost of industrial practices that prioritized short-term profits over human welfare. He had spent his adult life feeding London's population while slowly poisoning both himself and his customers. And now he was paying the final price for his unwitting participation in one of history's greatest public health disasters. The bread that continued to emerge from London's surviving bakeries carried with it the accumulated suffering of generations, of workers and consumers who had been sacrificed to the demands of industrial efficiency and maximum profitability. Every loaf represented not just sustenance, but a continuation of practices that had already claimed thousands of lives and would claim thousands more before meaningful change finally arrived. The Great Bread Reform, the turning point, came not from government action or industry reform, but from an unexpected source: the wives and mothers of London's working class, who finally said enough. The catalyst was 11-year-old Margaret Ashford, twin sister to one of the infants Dr. Hartley had documented as suffering from bread-related poisoning. Margaret had been fed the same contaminated bread as her brother, but while he had survived with developmental delays, she had not been so fortunate. Margaret's death in the winter of 1862 was officially attributed to consumption, the catch-all diagnosis that covered any wasting disease affecting the lungs. But her mother, Sarah Ashford, had watched her daughter's decline with the keen eye of a woman who had learned to recognize the signs of poisoning. The metallic taste that Margaret complained about, the way her hair had begun to fall out, the tremors in her small hands, these were not symptoms of consumption, but of something far more sinister. Sarah Ashford was not an educated woman. She could barely read and had never set foot inside a school. But she possessed something that proved more powerful than formal education: the desperate love of a mother who had watched one child damaged and another killed by food she had trusted to nourish them. When Margaret died, Sarah made a decision that would eventually reshape London's entire food system. She began talking to other mothers. The conversations started in the cramped tenements of Whitechapel, where women gathered to share the burden of grief and the weight of knowledge that their daily bread was slowly murdering their families. Sarah discovered that Margaret's symptoms had been replicated in dozens of other children throughout the neighborhood. Some had died, others had been left permanently damaged, and all had been consuming bread from the same network of local bakeries. Word spread through the informal networks that connected London's working-class women, the washerwomen who gathered at public pumps, the seamstresses who worked in crowded factories, the mothers who waited in bread lines each morning. What had begun as one woman's grief evolved into a grassroots investigation that was more thorough and effective than any official inquiry. The Women's Network had advantages that formal investigators lacked. They knew which families had suffered mysterious illnesses, which children had failed to develop normally, and which bakeries seemed to produce the most harmful products. They could trace patterns of disease and death through personal relationships rather than relying on incomplete official records. More importantly, they had nothing to lose. The professional investigators had careers to protect, political relationships to maintain, and economic interests to consider. The mothers of Whitechapel had already lost their children. Their only remaining goal was to prevent other families from suffering the same fate. The women's investigation revealed the full scope of food adulteration in ways that had never been documented before. They discovered that virtually every bakery in their neighborhood was using contaminated ingredients, but that some were far worse than others. They identified specific suppliers who provided the most toxic additives and traced the distribution networks that spread contaminated products throughout London. Sarah Ashford emerged as the leader of what would become known as the Bread Mothers' Crusade. She organized boycotts of the worst offending bakeries, coordinated group purchases from sources that claimed to use cleaner ingredients, and most importantly, began demanding answers from the men who had been profiting from the poisoning of their families. The first confrontation took place at Hartwell's rebuilt bakery, where William Hartwell found himself facing not individual customers making quiet complaints, but an organized group of 23 women who demanded to know exactly what he was putting in their bread. The women had armed themselves with samples of his products that had been analyzed by Dr. Hartley, and they presented Hartwell with detailed evidence of the toxic substances his bakery was selling as food. Hartwell's initial response was typical of his profession: denial, followed by blame shifting, and finally threats to refuse service to anyone who questioned his practices. But the women were prepared for this reaction. They had organized alternative sources of bread, however expensive and inconvenient, and they were prepared to put Hartwell out of business if he refused to change his methods. The economic pressure was immediate and effective. Hartwell's daily revenue dropped by more than half as the organized boycott took effect. Other customers, seeing the determination of the protesting women and hearing their evidence of contamination, began taking their business elsewhere as well. Within a week, Hartwell was forced to negotiate. The women's demands were simple: complete transparency about ingredients, elimination of all chemical additives, and independent verification of product safety. They also demanded compensation for families who had been harmed by contaminated bread, though they recognized that no amount of money could truly compensate for damaged or dead children. The success at Hartwell's bakery inspired similar actions throughout London. The Bread Mothers' Crusade spread to dozens of neighborhoods, with local groups of women organizing their own boycotts and demanding reforms from their local bakers. The movement grew rapidly, fueled by years of accumulated anger and the devastating effectiveness of coordinated economic pressure. The baking industry's response was predictably hostile. Trade associations denounced the women as hysterical troublemakers who didn't understand the complexities of food production. Some bakery owners hired thugs to intimidate the protesters, hoping that threats of violence would break up the organized boycotts. But the women had learned from the labor organizing efforts that were beginning to emerge in other industries. They established mutual support networks, shared resources to help families affected by economic retaliation, and maintained their solidarity in the face of increasingly desperate attempts to break their movement. The press initially dismissed the Bread Mothers Crusade as another example of feminine hysteria. But the mounting evidence of food contamination made it impossible to ignore the legitimacy of their concerns. Dr. Hartley and his colleagues provided scientific support for the women's claims, publishing detailed analyses that confirmed the presence of toxic substances in bread from the targeted bakeries. The combination of grassroots organizing, scientific evidence, and economic pressure created a crisis that could no longer be ignored by government authorities. Parliament was forced to hold hearings on food adulteration, and for the first time, the victims of contaminated food were given a platform to tell their stories directly to the officials who had previously ignored their suffering. Sarah Ashford's testimony before Parliament was a masterpiece of moral clarity. She described watching her daughter die from preventable poisoning, while the men responsible for that poisoning continued to profit from their crimes. She challenged the lawmakers to explain why the economic interests of bakery owners were considered more important than the lives of working-class children. The political impact was immediate. Members of Parliament who had previously resisted food safety legislation found themselves unable to defend their positions in the face of testimony from grieving mothers. The public gallery was packed with women from the Bread Mothers Crusade, their silent presence a powerful reminder of the human cost of regulatory inaction. The Food and Drugs Act of 1875 was the eventual result of this pressure. Though it took years of continued organizing to achieve meaningful enforcement, the law required accurate labeling of food products, prohibited the use of harmful adulterants, and established a system of government inspectors with real authority to shut down dangerous operations. But the Bread Mothers Crusade had achieved something more important than legislation. They had changed the fundamental relationship between food producers and consumers. The old system of trust and ignorance had been replaced by one of transparency and accountability. Customers now demanded to know what was in their food, and they had demonstrated their willingness to use economic pressure to enforce their demands. The immediate impact on the baking industry was dramatic. Bakeries that refused to eliminate toxic additives found themselves without customers. New businesses emerged to serve the market for clean bread, often founded by former industrial bakers who had been sickened by their working conditions and wanted to provide genuine alternatives. Thomas Whitmore, in his final months of life, witnessed the transformation of the industry that had destroyed his health. The bakeries that remained in business were cleaner, safer, and more transparent about their ingredients and methods. The bread they produced was more expensive than the contaminated products of the past. But working-class families had demonstrated their willingness to pay higher prices for food that wouldn't poison their children. The reforms came too late to save Thomas, Peter Milhouse, Margaret Ashford, and thousands of others who had been sacrificed to industrial greed and regulatory neglect. But their suffering had not been entirely meaningless if it prevented future generations from enduring the same fate. The Bread Mothers Crusade became a model for consumer organizing that was replicated in other industries and other countries. The women who had organized to protect their families from contaminated bread went on to campaign for workplace safety, housing reform, and other issues that affected their communities. They had discovered that ordinary people, when organized and determined, could challenge powerful interests and win. Sarah Ashford lived to see her surviving child grow to adulthood with none of the developmental problems that had affected his twin sister. She continued to advocate for food safety until her death in 1893, always insisting that the price of safe food was eternal vigilance by the people who consumed it. The transformation of London's bread industry was not complete. Economic pressures continued to create incentives for corner cutting and contamination. But the balance of power had shifted permanently. Consumers now had both the knowledge and the organizational tools necessary to hold food producers accountable for the safety of their products. The era when bakers could poison their customers with impunity was finally coming to an end, brought about not by the wisdom of experts or the compassion of officials, but by the determined action of mothers who refused to accept that their children's deaths were the acceptable cost of industrial progress. The final loaf de Moss, Whitmore's last day as a baker, began, like so many others, with violent coughing that doubled him over and left him gasping for air that seemed to contain no oxygen. But this morning, in March 1865, there was something different in the black phlegm he spat onto the floor of his cramped tenement room. Flecks of bright red blood mixed with the familiar coal-black sputum, creating a pattern that looked disturbingly like the marble veining in the tombstones that had been ground up to whiten his bread so many years before. Mary Whitmore watched her husband struggle to dress himself, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely fasten the buttons on his flour-stained shirt. At 44, Thomas looked like a man in his 70s, his hair completely grey and falling out in patches, his skin bearing the sallow, waxy complexion of someone whose organs were slowly shutting down from decades of chemical poisoning. "You don't have to go in today," Mary said quietly, though they both knew the words were meaningless. Thomas had been surviving on irregular employment for the past 2 years, taking whatever work he could find as his health deteriorated. The new reform bakeries that had emerged after the bread mothers' crusade demanded higher standards of cleanliness and competence than Thomas could now provide. While the old-style establishments were gradually being shut down by government inspectors. "I can still work," Thomas wheezed, though his voice was barely audible. The neurological damage from years of lead and mercury exposure had affected his vocal cords, along with his memory and motor control. Some days he couldn't remember his wife's name or recognize his own children. Other days, like today, his mind was clear enough to understand that his body was finally giving up the fight against the industrial poisons that had been accumulating in his tissues for over 20 years. The bakery where Thomas had found temporary employment was one of the last holdouts against the new food safety regulations, located in a basement beneath a gin shop in Bermondsey. It served the poorest customers who still couldn't afford the clean bread that was becoming available elsewhere in London. The owner, Jacob Ramsey, was a bitter man who blamed the bread mothers' crusade for destroying what he called honest business practices and driving up the cost of feeding the working. Poor Thomas descended the familiar stone steps into the toxic atmosphere that had defined his adult life. The basement was smaller and more primitive than Hartwell's had been, with only 2 ovens and ventilation that consisted of a single chimney that barely drew enough air to keep the fires burning. The walls were stained with years of accumulated soot and chemical residue, and the floor was littered with rat droppings and the remains of insects that had been overcome by the toxic fumes. Ramsey greeted Thomas with the contempt reserved for workers who had become more liability than asset. "You're late again, Whitmore, and you look like death warmed over. Maybe it's time you found some other line of work." The suggestion would have been laughable if it weren't so cruel. Thomas's lungs were so damaged that he could barely climb stairs without stopping to rest. His hands shook too badly to perform delicate tasks. His memory was so unreliable that he couldn't be trusted with complex instructions. The only thing he knew how to do was bake bread, and even that skill was increasingly beyond his physical capabilities. "I can still work," Thomas repeated, the same phrase that had become his daily mantra. He moved slowly toward the mixing area, where sacks of flour waited to be transformed into the day's production. The flour was the cheapest available, grey-tinted and contaminated with the usual array of adults. Despite the new regulations, Ramsay continued to use chemical whitening agents, claiming that customers demanded white bread regardless of the health consequences, as Thomas began the familiar process of measuring and mixing ingredients. His damaged nervous system began to play tricks on him. For a moment, he thought he saw Peter Milhouse working at the adjacent table, his young face serious with concentration as he kneaded a batch of dough. Thomas blinked, and the hallucination faded, leaving him alone with the knowledge that his friend had been dead for 3 years. The work that had once been second nature now required intense concentration and effort. Thomas's hands cramped repeatedly, forcing him to stop and rest every few minutes. His vision blurred frequently, making it difficult to judge the consistency of the dough. His breathing was so labored that he had to pause regularly to catch his breath, though each pause brought little relief. The other workers in the bakery, 2 young men who had been desperate enough to take employment despite the obvious health risks, watched Thomas with a mixture of pity and fear. They could see their own future in his deteriorating condition, and they understood that they were witnessing the final stages of a process that had already begun in their own bodies. By midday, Thomas could no longer maintain the pretense of useful work. His last batch of bread had come out burned on the bottom and raw in the center, a combination that would have been impossible for him to produce in his prime. His hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't hold tools steady, and his coughing fits were becoming more frequent and violent. "That's enough," Ramsay announced with obvious disgust. "You're done, Whitmore. Don't come back. I can't afford to have you ruining my product and scaring away the other workers." Thomas nodded without argument. He had known this moment was coming, and in some ways, he was relieved that the charade was finally over. He removed his flour-dusted apron for the last time and hung it on a nail that had held the aprons of dozens of bakers over the years, many of whom were now dead from the same occupational diseases that were killing him. The walk home took nearly 2 hours, though the distance was less than a mile. Thomas had to stop frequently to rest, leaning against buildings while waves of dizziness and nausea washed over him. Passers-by gave him a wide berth, recognizing the symptoms of advanced industrial poisoning and fearing that his condition might be contagious. Mary was waiting for him when he finally arrived home, and the look on her face told him that she already knew what had happened. She helped him into bed without asking questions, understanding that his working life was over and that the final stage of his decline had begun. The next few weeks passed in a blur of increasing weakness and confusion. Dr. Hartley visited regularly, providing what comfort he could while documenting Thomas's symptoms for his ongoing research into occupational diseases. The physician's notes from this period would later be used to support legislation requiring workplace safety protections for industrial workers. Thomas's mind wandered frequently between the present and memories of his early days as a baker. He spoke often about his first morning at Hartwell's bakery, when he had been young and strong and proud to have steady employment. He talked about Peter Milhouse as if his friend was still alive, carrying on conversations about work techniques and sharing jokes that only made sense to men who had spent their lives in the toxic atmosphere of Victorian bakeries. On his clearer days, Thomas expressed regret about his role in poisoning London's population. He understood that every loaf of bread he had produced had contributed to the suffering of families who had trusted him to provide safe food. The knowledge that children had been damaged or killed by bread made with his own hands was a burden that added psychological suffering to his physical decline. "I didn't know," he would whisper to Mary during his lucid moments. "We all knew the ingredients weren't right, but we didn't understand what they were doing to people. We thought we were just trying to survive, to feed our own families. We didn't know we were murderers." Mary tried to comfort him with assurances that he had been a victim of the same system that had harmed his customers. But Thomas's guilt was not easily assuaged. He had spent his adult life as an unwitting accomplice in one of the greatest public health disasters in human history, and no amount of rational explanation could eliminate the moral weight of that participation. The end came on a grey April morning, with Thomas surrounded by his wife and children in the same cramped tenement room where he had begun each working day for over 2 decades. His final words were an apology to Peter Milhouse, whom he saw standing beside his bed in the early morning light. Thomas Whitmore was buried in a pauper cemetery in a grave marked only by a wooden cross that would rot away within a few years. No obituary mentioned his passing, no memorial celebrated his life, and no monument recorded his contribution to feeding London's population. He had been one of thousands of workers whose lives had been consumed by industrial processes that valued profit over human welfare, but Thomas's death did not go entirely unnoticed. Dr. Hartley included his case in a comprehensive study of occupational diseases that would influence workplace safety legislation for decades to come. The detailed documentation of Thomas's decline provided evidence for the long-term effects of chemical exposure that helped support arguments for better worker protections. Sarah Ashford, the leader of the Bread Mothers Crusade, attended Thomas's funeral as a representative of the reform movement. She understood that workers like Thomas had been victims as well as perpetrators, trapped in a system that gave them no choice but to participate in practices that harmed both themselves and their customers. The bakery where Thomas had worked his final day was shut down by government inspectors just 2 months after his death. Ramsay was fined for violating food safety regulations and eventually went out of business, unable to compete with establishments that had adopted cleaner production methods by the time of Thomas's death. The worst abuses of Victorian food production were already being eliminated through a combination of regulation, consumer pressure, and industry reform. The bread available in London shops was cleaner, safer, and more nutritious than anything that had been produced during Thomas's working career. The transformation had come too late to save Thomas, Peter, Margaret, Ashford, and thousands of others who had been sacrificed to industrial progress. But their suffering had not been entirely meaningless if it contributed to creating a food system that no longer routinely poisoned the people it was supposed to nourish. Thomas Whitmore's story was the story of an entire generation of workers who had lived and died during the transition from traditional craftsmanship to industrial mass production. They had been guinea pigs in an uncontrolled experiment in chemical food processing, and their bodies had paid the price for society's education about the real costs of industrial efficiency. The bread that emerged from London's reformed bakeries in the years following Thomas's death was a testament to the possibility of producing food that was both affordable and safe. The workers who made this bread enjoyed better working conditions, higher wages, and longer lives than their predecessors. The customers who consumed it could feed their children without fear of poisoning them. The transformation of London's bread industry represented both the worst and best impulses of industrial civilization. It showed how the pursuit of profit could lead to the systematic poisoning of entire populations, but also how organized resistance and regulatory reform could eventually create better outcomes for both workers and consumers. Thomas Whitmore had lived through the worst of this system and died just as it was beginning to change for the better. His final loaf of bread, burned and poorly made though it was, represented the end of an era when feeding people and killing them were considered compatible goals in the name of economic progress. Legacy of the loaf. 20 years after Thomas Whitmore's death, London had become a different city. The acrid fog that had once choked the streets was beginning to clear as cleaner industrial processes replaced the primitive methods of the early Victorian era. The Thames, while still far from pristine, no longer resembled an open sewer, and in the bakeries scattered throughout the city's neighborhoods, men worked in conditions that would have seemed impossibly luxurious to Thomas and his generation. Mary Whitmore, now a widow in her 60s, occasionally walked past the site where Hartwell's bakery had once stood. The building had been demolished years earlier, replaced by a modern establishment with large windows, proper ventilation, and working conditions that bore little resemblance to the toxic dungeons where her husband had spent his working life. The new bakery employed 12 men who earned decent wages, worked reasonable hours, and could expect to live long enough to see their grandchildren grow up. The transformation had not happened overnight, nor had it come easily. The Food and Drugs Act of 1875 had provided a legal framework for reform, but enforcement had been a decades-long struggle against entrenched interests and established practices. Every improvement in food safety had been fought for by activists like Sarah Ashford, documented by researchers like Dr. Edmund Hartley, and ultimately paid for with the lives of workers like Thomas Whitmore. Dr. Hartley, now in his 70s and recognized as one of Britain's leading authorities on occupational health, had spent the better part of 2 decades compiling a comprehensive record of the human costs of Victorian industrial practices. His final report, published in 1885, documented over 3,000 cases of illness and death directly attributable to food adulteration and unsafe working conditions in London's baking industry. The statistics were sobering. During the peak years of food contamination, between 1840 and 1875, life expectancy in neighborhoods dependent on adulterated bread was 15 to 20 years, shorter than in areas where cleaner food was available. Child mortality rates were nearly double. Rates of developmental disabilities, chronic illnesses, and premature death created a hidden epidemic that had affected hundreds of thousands of people. But Dr. Hartley's research also documented the remarkable improvements that had followed the implementation of food safety regulations. By 1885, the incidence of food-related illness had dropped by more than 70%. Children born after the reforms showed normal development patterns and life expectancies comparable to their middle-class counterparts. The working-class communities that had been devastated by toxic food were finally beginning to recover. The economic transformation was equally dramatic. The clean bakeries that had emerged after the bread mothers' crusade initially charged higher prices for their products, leading to concerns that safe food would become a luxury available only to the wealthy. But increased competition, improved efficiency, and economies of scale had gradually brought prices down to levels that working-class families could afford. More importantly, the elimination of toxic additives had actually improved the nutritional value of bread while reducing its cost of production. Clean flour, while initially more expensive than adulterated varieties, produced better-tasting bread that customers preferred. The elimination of chemical processing steps reduced manufacturing costs. The improved health of workers meant lower turnover and higher productivity. Sarah Ashford, now in her 60s and still active in food safety advocacy, had lived to see the complete transformation of London's food system. The Bread Mothers Crusade had evolved into a permanent consumer watchdog organization that monitored food quality and pushed for continued improvements in safety standards. Similar movements had emerged in other cities throughout Britain and in other countries. Countries that were experiencing rapid industrialization. The success of the bread reforms had inspired similar campaigns against adulteration in other food products. Milk, tea, sugar, and dozens of other staples had been cleaned up through the same combination of consumer organizing, scientific research, and regulatory enforcement that had transformed the baking industry. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Victorian bread disasters was the principle that had emerged from the struggle. The idea that consumers had a right to know what was in their food and that producers had a responsibility to ensure the safety of their products. This principle, revolutionary in its time, had become so thoroughly accepted that it was difficult to imagine a society that had once operated on different assumptions. The legal framework established during the Reform era had provided the foundation for increasingly sophisticated systems of food safety regulation. Government inspectors now had real authority to shut down dangerous operations. Standards for ingredients, processing methods, and working conditions were clearly defined and consistently enforced. The burden of proof had shifted from consumers, who had once been forced to demonstrate that food was harmful, to producers, who now had to prove that their products were safe. The scientific understanding of nutrition and food safety had also advanced dramatically since Thomas Whitmore's time. The connection between diet and health was now well established, and the mechanisms by which toxic substances damage the human body were increasingly well understood. This knowledge enabled more effective regulation and helped consumers make informed choices about the food they purchased. The cultural impact of the bread reforms extended far beyond food safety. The success of the Bread Mothers Crusade had demonstrated that ordinary people could organize effectively to challenge powerful interests and achieve meaningful change. The model of consumer organizing that Sarah Ashford had pioneered was being applied to issues ranging from workplace safety to housing, reform to women's suffrage. The transformation of London's bakeries had also changed the nature of the work itself. Baking had evolved from a dangerous trade that shortened lives into a respectable profession that offered decent wages and safe working conditions. The men who worked in the modern bakeries were skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work and could expect to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Young apprentices now learned their trade in clean, well-lit workshops where safety was a priority rather than an afterthought. They were taught not just the techniques of bread making, but the principles of hygiene and food safety that would protect both themselves and their customers. The knowledge that had once been hidden from workers, the contents of ingredients, the effects of various additives, the health risks of different processes, was now part of their basic education. The bread that emerged from London's reformed bakeries was not just safer than its predecessors. It was actually superior in every measurable way. It tasted better, lasted longer, provided better nutrition, and cost less to produce. The toxic shortcuts that had once seemed necessary for profitability had actually been obstacles to creating genuinely good products. The international reputation of British food products, which had been severely damaged by decades of contamination scandals, was gradually being restored. Foreign buyers were once again willing to purchase British agricultural products, confident that they met acceptable standards of quality and safety. This improvement in international trade relationships provided economic benefits that far exceeded the costs of implementing food safety reforms. The memory of the Victorian bread disasters was preserved in various ways throughout London. Memorials to the victims of food contamination stood in several neighbourhoods where the death toll had been particularly high. Schools taught children about the importance of food safety and the history of the reforms that had made clean food possible. Museums displayed examples of the toxic ingredients that had once been common in bread, serving as reminders of how far society had progressed. But perhaps the most fitting memorial was the simple fact that mothers could now feed their children without fear. The anxiety that had once plagued every meal, the constant worry that daily bread might be slowly poisoning the people you loved most, had been eliminated through the determined efforts of people who had refused to accept that such suffering was inevitable. Mary Whitmore lived to see her own grandchildren grow up healthy and strong, consuming bread that would have seemed impossibly pure and safe to their grandfather. When she died peacefully in 1895, she was buried beside Thomas in a grave that now bore a proper headstone, paid for by the Reformed Bakers Guild as a tribute to the workers who had sacrificed their lives during the industry's darkest years. The inscription on the headstone was simple: Thomas Whitmore, baker, he fed London. There was no mention of the toxic ingredients, the dangerous working conditions, or the system that had consumed his life and the lives of so many others. But those who understood the history knew that Thomas's legacy was not just the bread he had made, but the reforms his suffering had made possible. The story of Victorian bread was ultimately a story of human progress achieved through terrible cost. It demonstrated both the capacity for industrial systems to cause immense harm and the power of organized people to demand better. The bread that London's citizens consumed in 1895 was not just food. It was proof that change was possible, that suffering was not inevitable, and that ordinary people could reshape the world when they refused to accept injustice as normal. The deadly job of a Victorian baker had become, through struggle and sacrifice, simply the job of a baker. The transformation was complete, but the memory of what had been lost and what had been gained would endure, as long as people remembered that the price of safety is eternal vigilance, and that the most ordinary acts, like baking bread, can become either instruments of harm or expressions of care, depending on the values and choices of those who perform them. In the end, Thomas Whitmore and his generation had not died in vain if their sacrifice had contributed to creating a world where no one would have to choose between earning a living and preserving their health, where no parent would have to fear that feeding their children might be harming them, and where the basic act of baking bread could once again be what it was meant to be: an expression of human creativity in service of human nourishment.